Hello, so this is part 2 of a video that was only supposed to be one part, but due to me having a terrible computer, it had to be divided into 2. If you haven't seen the first part, which is definitely out now, I highly suggest checking it out. I know my voice, you probably don't want to listen to it for what amounts to over 5 hours, but it's sort of meant to have that context. If you don't want to watch it that way, that's fine too. But just to let you know, this is going to feel jarring, and there's a reason for that. Okay, enjoy. At the beginning of March, I made the difficult but necessary decision to halt all production on this video and replay Veilguard. That was a decision that had been a long time coming, as I do believe games with such a vast array of choice do require multiple playthroughs to properly critique. I wanted to do the replay anyway. The problem was less my will to do so, and far more the time constraints and storage the project had already taken. But it was absolutely the right decision. I've now spent around 250 hours in Veilguard, give or take pause menu idleness, and I'm very thankful I did that because it changed my perspective on a great many things. But it did complicate the creation of this video tremendously. I've rewritten multiple sections of this script in the immense amount of time I've been working on it. But there is no section of the script I've rewritten more than I have covering Veilguard. Through that process, I've begun to realize that I am becoming more and more defensive of this game for a variety of reasons. The public reception and the inter-fandom discourse, this overall video idea and how I thought the series was seen, and my own personal experience with the game all played key parts in the evolution of this section of the video. Throughout the entire process of this project, I've had moments where I just wanted to stop, to quit. But during this specific area of the video, I almost gave up several times for varying reasons, one of which being the second time I've recorded this fully edited area because I overwrote the save, which was certainly something that set me back. But even with that in mind, probably the most prevalent reason has been my inability to capture my feelings for this game without some level of defensive bias. I took breaks here and there to play other games, and that reminded me of some of the game's very glaring flaws. As I entered the 6th calendar month of working on this video, however, I finally came to a realization. That bias is part of the entire thesis of this whole video. That bias is explained by the story of how we got here, the overall story of Dragon Age as a whole, and the frustrations I have with nostalgia discourse so strong and so uncritical that the games aren't even being seen by rose-tinted glasses, but instead from cataract eyes. In this video, I have attempted to be incredibly critical of the previous games. Not because I dislike them, or even particularly wanted to be hard on them. I don't want to be hard on Dragon Age on the internet right now. But I did it instead to indicate that massive change is the rule of the series, not the exception. Now that we've reached Veilguard, I won't shy away from critiquing it, but I will offer it something that the internet as a whole has refused to give it: grace. Veilguard is not a bad game. It is in fact an incredibly tight and well-designed experience, perhaps better implemented with less bugs than any game in the series. The extreme switch in gameplay might be one that alienates fans, but it's absolutely hard to argue it's not done at an extremely high level. This, however, is never mentioned, and that is somewhat understandable considering the Dragon Age series is one so heavily built off of character, which of course is at the center of the cyclone of discourse around the game here on YouTube. This catastrophizing of the game on release is something that I have watched happen with each and every entry, and even been guilty of myself. However, in this cycle, it has encompassed Veilguard's entire existence in a way that is unfair, unbalanced, but perhaps not surprising. With whatever I say for the rest of this section, I want to make one thing clear. My goal here is not to dismiss criticism of Veilguard. In fact, I myself will be criticizing Veilguard. I would just like to ask for specificity in critique, and especially the long and complicated history of this series when critiquing it. What Veilguard also is, just as much as the second game in the series was, is a massive new direction for the series in many, many ways. I truly cannot be upset with those that cannot accept this new direction. I would contend, however, that even if those changes were done to chase a trend, it is still the culmination of a series of decisions that we've watched occur over the series' 15-year lifespan. It is difficult to approach critiquing this game, because so many bad faith actors have done such a great job at selling the fact that this game is just awful top to bottom in every aspect, and that stance is just not one that matches reality. It is still, however, a game built off an amount of change that is quite jarring, and those changes are at the center of what makes the game so very flawed. But that change was not made in a vacuum. If Dragon Age 2 was the inciting incident that put the series on shaky ground in terms of identity, Veilguard is the climax of that. But in order to understand that, like Inquisition, we need to understand the environment it was released into. Baldur's Gate 3 was released in August of 2023. It had been in early access since 2020, which made me lose track of the project entirely until just before release. Larian Studios, the most recent group to gain the D&D license, had already become one of the innovators at the front of the CRPG scene, a genre that had begun a slow rebirth in the mid-2010s, once again proving that AAA studios tend to be wrong and genres don't die. I was immediately shocked by how much press it got, as I did not expect a CRPG of that nature to get that type of attention. However, the reasons it did were not hard to wrap my head around. D&D as a whole saw a rebirth in the mid-2010s, with a new system that was easier to onboard new players with, leading to incredibly popular streams playing the game doing huge numbers, all coinciding with nerd culture as a whole being destigmatized and encouraged, unlike its earlier days. The power of the D&D license was likely a massive propeller of interest in the project, and it certainly helped that the reports from early access had all been exceptional, and that the AAA marketplace at the time was barren. And I'm sure that viral bear scene certainly helped things out. The reasoning mattered very little in the end. The moment the game came out, people knew it was not only of extremely high quality in a way most big games aren't anymore, but also groundbreaking for the gaming scene. Immediately murmurings in Bioware spaces online were that Veilguard couldn't even compare to it, and realistically they weren't wrong if you viewed their comments through the lens of what DA was in its first outing. While the majority of the game was very much a modern true successor to how the original Baldur's Gate worked, it also seemed to take heavily from Origins. Companions worked very much the same. The story structure, while different and unique, still had similarities and inspirations. The gaming market had returned to what made Bioware great, without Bioware present. And with that return came an entry that would end up being one of the best-selling of its genre, a testament to what AAA gaming was doing wrong. One of the best games ever made had casually dropped, and everything was different overnight. Much like Skyrim before it, the RPG market had changed, and it had changed forever. Meanwhile, back at the studio that had started it all, the latest Dragon Age game was 9 years into production, and gearing up for its final leg of the journey. But unlike Larian's ode to classic CRPGs, Veilguard was very much a AAA vision. Dragon Age was caught in an unfortunate position. They had repeated what was done with Inquisition and chosen to chase a trend. by creating a game that very much moved away from the series' RPG history, and instead chose to embrace the popularity of Sony and Sony-like single-player experiences. This choice would be a curse upon Veilguard, as the arrival of Baldur's Gate 3 proved that these wild departures were not only unnecessary, but an outdated trend to chase. This was inevitably going to be a disappointment in the eyes of many fans of Bioware, who not only were in love with BG3, but who also had very often backed BG3's early access and kept its name alive with the same art and fanfiction they had for Bioware years earlier. The heart of BG3 was classic Bioware, and now the fanbase wished for a game more like it than what was to come. But the Veilguard team no longer had a choice in the matter. There was no chance to pivot this time. The production was entering its final stages, and there was no pushing it back anymore. While we know that previous iterations of Dragon Age 4 involved talk of live service aspects, I do want to take one moment to dismiss a common talking point. Gang, I'm going to be honest, everything you point out for this particular talking point is heavily taken from God of War 2018. In fact, Veilguard took huge swaths from God of War 2018. These are not live service elements, I promise you, it's Sony single-player syndrome. The ghosts of live service games are here, but it's not menus and treasure chests. But regardless, yes, a decent amount of production history does seem to indicate the game was going in the live service direction. One rumor that has followed the production for a while, however, is that Mass Effect Legendary Edition was a huge boon to the team. This rumor has yet to be confirmed, despite coming from very credible news outlets, so I hesitate to give it too much importance. However, the one thing we do know for a fact was that Legendary Edition's massive release sales came as a big surprise to EA, which is pretty typical for EA. They don't understand anything really at all. The rumor goes that the success gave members of Bioware the leverage to push their projects more heavily toward a single-player focus. After all, if you go to work for someone like Bioware, you likely are a fan of their previous games and not Anthem. This rumor does line up with the knowledge that there was a huge shift in the Dragon Age project around that time, finally garnering a focus that the project had seemingly not had before that. One re-release had seemingly, reportedly, gotten the studio back on track towards both the next Dragon Age and the newly returned Mass Effect project. Fast forward, while Baldur's Gate 3 is a couple weeks into its launch, Bioware is in the midst of a massive layoff scandal. DA4 is entering alpha, and yet the studio, whether it be by their choice or by EA's choice, has just let go nearly 50 employees, including some major department members on the new game. Bioware head Gary McKay made a statement at the launch of DAV that it was to make the team smaller to retain focus, but if you believe that, I don't know what to tell you. It kind of sounds like an excuse for a really gross business practice where you use a ton of people and then get rid of them before the game releases, and they can actually show the effort they put into something in order to get a better job. It kind of sounds like they were used up and thrown out, including one of the character leads in Mary Kirby, who had been there forever, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a person with a moral compass. And surely this will not be an indicator of what might happen down the road. Nothing at all to keep in mind, surely. Anyway, bottom line, so many people had just lost their jobs in the midst of a massive project by which their work would still heavily be in use. The point of all of this is twofold. First, Baldur's Gate 3 was not a boon to Veilguard. I foolishly believed at the time that it would be, that this companion-based RPG system that Bioware had fostered getting popular in another game would only encourage Veilguard. However, that was deeply, deeply naive. The truth was, BG3 was a once-in-a-generation game release, and Veilguard, not able to capitalize on that in any way, was destined to release and pale in comparison. Baldur's Gate 3 was everything Dragon Age Origins set out to be, and Dragon Age as a whole had evolved away from that almost immediately. In the face of a game that represented, quite literally, what Dragon Age Origins originally set out to be, standing on the market uncompromised and succeeding, Veilguard's archaic devolution of that original genre it started as looked like the chasing of trends Bioware had always been guilty of, following in the footsteps of what was popular outside of their genre and their fan base, while the ground actively shifted beneath their feet. Expectation is a difficult shadow to exist within. Coming out in the shadow of the hottest selling CRPG of the decade is a difficult enough task, but that wasn't the only thing that held Veilguard back. It was also the victim of a long production cycle, one that built up hype to an unrealistic expectation, destined to never meet the high expectations Trespasser's Legacy had built, both as a fantastic standalone DLC setup for the next game, as well as a nostalgic lens through which to view the promise of the next iteration. Dragon Age Keep offered its own expectation, its mere existence preluding an assumption that proved untrue. Its gameplay was expected to at least mirror something close to a previous entry, and that expectation did not survive contact with the next game. In some ways, Veilguard's public perception reminds me of that response I had to DA2 so many years ago, that gut instinct that still irks me, and I get it. I really do. But having that crash out with my own expectations so many years ago, it has allowed me to take Veilguard for what it is rather than what it isn't, and I truly think there's value in Dragon Age: The Veilguard. I just also happen to think that the series' lack of identity up to this point, the corporate need to constantly shift, made Veilguard a perfect storm of disappointed expectations. And also, the culmination of the journey we've taken in this video. With that in mind, let's get our hands dirty and start off with the wildest swing, and yet perhaps the best handled aspect of the game. The moment-to-moment gameplay of Veilguard is a really smooth experience. Combat in particular is a huge upgrade over Inquisition, as the change in speeds makes for a far more engaging experience than what the compromised DAI had to offer did. There's a synergy in building a character in the game that I genuinely enjoyed more than nearly any other combat system in the series. I've only played a rogue so far, but I very quickly felt like the wide range of options presented to me allowed for very specific builds that weren't possible in previous games. By the end of the game, I had created a build that was nearly impossible to run out of arrows with, that allowed me to slow things down and properly aim, while also using one of the game's cursed high-level weapons to always give my melee attacks necrosis, which did huge amounts of damage against most enemies when I was pressed and had to close-up fight. All of this is built off of the level up system, which I frankly find to be superb. There's a power in these builds that haven't been present since playing a mage in DA2, and god did I enjoy it. It also greatly helps that the radio menu that allows you to ask your companions to use abilities is far better than what Mass Effect offers. In Mass Effect, I barely ever use the feature, but I use the menu constantly throughout the game, activating my own abilities and my allies' abilities, asking them to heal me, and performing massive combination attacks. That radio menu did help me come to terms with the loss of controllable companions, even if I would have still preferred that system. Another perfect example of how much I enjoyed this system. At one point in the game, I managed to unlock a section of the crossroads that I was clearly not ready for yet. The game warned me the enemy at the end of the area was going to be difficult, so I saved and went in anyway to check it out. The enemy had an indicator above it that was 20 levels higher than where I was. It hit like a truck, doing 3/4 of my health every single time I missed a dodge, and quickly I ran out of ways to heal. When I finally died, however, I realized I had whittled this high-level boss down to under half, and the "if it bleeds, it dies" part of my brain kicked in. I changed out my party so that I had 2 healers and tried the boss again. Through a huge amount of dodging and selective attacks, I was able to beat it the second time around, accessing a higher level weapon than I was technically allowed to have at that time, and it was chef's kiss. Now, these are huge changes, so the amount you like or dislike them may vary depending on your mileage. If your love of the series is its status as a CRPG, I'm afraid no amount of well-implemented high-speed action combat will make up for just how far from its original premise the series has gotten. The loss of controlling your companions, or even having 4 companions at the same time, is still glaring. And while action combos and environmental abilities do put more attention on your companions, this game very much does play like a single character-focused experience, with very little party composition options. Based off of my experience with the game, the amount that your allies add to the combat experience is limited to those occasional abilities, and in between those moments, it often feels like they do very little. There are small ways you can allow your allies to help more, such as adding buffs that support your damage output, but generally, on their own, they do very, very little. This is a huge loss, as team building has always been a huge part of the series. I know there's a part of the community that preferred the slower gameplay, as they like the series for more cozy gaming reasons, or who physically have more trouble with games like Veilguard. I can report, as someone who is physically disabled and riddled with arthritis, that this game was far more difficult than previous games. However, I did find it rewarding enough to get past the pain. Again, your mileage may vary. The game also has a wide series of accessibility options, which does allow for a certain amount of help with the massive change in gameplay. Whether that's enough for this big of a style difference, however, I'm not sure. I can say with certainty that I still would have preferred the CRPG elements of the game present. However, I do find the way they implemented the game to make that loss understandable, and I wouldn't say it was a surprise to me. As Mark Dara and other devs have pointed out, very few players actually use the CRPG elements they put into Inquisition, so I'm not totally surprised by this drastic change, even if I'm disappointed. To quote Mark Dara from his Memories and Lessons Inquisition video, he talks a little bit about the frustrations the Origins team had with implementing it, and goes on to talk specifically about the difficulties of the TAC cam and its new approach in Inquisition. Quote, "The telemetry of the TAC cam from Dragon Age Inquisition basically shows that very few people used it. And those people who did use it largely to pause, look around at the battlefield, decide what they're going to do, and then return to the over-the-shoulder camera and play the game in real time for the most part. Actually, if you watch my streams of Dragon Age Origins, that's pretty much how I'm using TACCam in Dragon Age Origins. I very rarely use TACCam. I mostly do it to set up a few things, then largely play out the game in real time. The fact that it being the TACCam implementation is very expensive, plus the fact that it wasn't widely used, and you can argue that part of the reason it's not widely used is because it's not the best possible implementation of it. Those two things together, to my mind, mean probably we're not going to see a TACCam going forward from the Dragon Age franchise. I mean, they could surprise me. My bet is that Dragon Age will continue cementing itself as an action RPG franchise, and continue to move away from the old school CRPG things that mark its origins, so to speak." Unquote. To be clear, this was written by Mark Dara while he didn't work at Bioware, and I had watched this before the game even came out. It's for that reason why I wasn't surprised by the change they made, even if I was surprised by how far they took it. I don't at all think the change is worth what we lost, but I do think a middle ground they attempted to strike is at least fun and keeps a tiny semblance of the tactics that were lost. Now, if your instinct is to blame the people that worked on the game for this change, I'd like to tepidly add one last Bioware insider perspective, this time from David Gator, to quote a recent post on Blue Sky he made during one of his many threads reflecting on the series. Quote, "Things at Bioware felt like they were at their height when the Doctors, Ray and Greg the founders, were still there. We made RPGs, full stop. We made them well. Sure, there were some shitty parts, some of which I didn't realize how shitty they were until I left, but I'd never worked anywhere else." Unquote. Later in the thread, he goes on to describe his experience leaving the DA team and moving on to help other projects. Quote, "So I joined the new project that the former Mass Effect team in Edmonton was cooking up, the one that became Anthem, but at the time was codenamed Dylan. This was a mistake. You see, the thing you need to know about Bioware is that for a long time it was basically two teams under one roof, the Dragon Age team and the Mass Effect team. Run differently, very different cultures, may as well have been two separate studios, and they didn't get along. The company was aware of the friction, and attempts to fix it had been ongoing for years, mainly by shuffling staff between the teams more often. Yet this didn't really solve things, and I had no idea until I got to the Dylan team. The team didn't want me there, at all. Worse, until this point Dylan had been concepted as kind of a beer and cigarettes hard sci-fi setting, a la Aliens, and I'd been given the instructions to turn it into something more science fantasy, a la Star Wars. Yet I don't think anyone told the team this, so they thought this change was my doing. I kept getting feedback about how it was too Dragon Age, and how everything I wrote or planned was too Dragon Age. The implication being that anything like Dragon Age was bad. And yet this was a team where I was required to accept and act on all feedback, so I ended up iterating constantly. I won't go into details about the problems, except to say it became clear this was a team that didn't want to make an RPG. Were very anti-RPG, in fact. Yet they wanted me to wave my magic writing wand and create a Bioware quality story without giving me any of the tools I'd need to actually do it. I saw the writing on the wall. This wasn't going to work. So I called up my boss and said that I'd stick it out and try my best, but only if there was something waiting for me on the other side where I could have more say as a creative director. I wanted to move up. I was turned down flat, no hesitation. That said a lot. Even more when I was told that, while I could leave the company if I wanted to, I wouldn't have any success outside of Bioware. But in blunter words. So I quit. Unquote. Between these two quotes and what other members of the team have said that stretch back to the very early days of EA's acquisition of Bioware, it is very clear that this change from what Dragon Age was to what it is now was not the sole choice made by the dev team, but instead one encouraged by the Bioware higher-ups. This, coupled with all we've learned so far, should put into perspective the kind of pressure this team and past teams were working under. No moment in Veilguard's development is more damning than the knowledge of how Bioware and half the company saw RPGs. You don't have to look for all these clues to find live service remnants in the game. I think pointing out that this CRPG is now a Sony-influenced action hack-and-slasher is enough of an issue to fully explain what happened here. I think the problem, as seems to so often be the case, is Bioware and its role as an EA subsidiary. Regardless of how I might feel on if that direction change was the right decision, it's hard to argue the transition itself wasn't well handled. I had a ton of fun with Veilguard, and I would dare say that in terms of pure design, even if it's not what I wanted, it is perhaps the most polished experience Bioware has offered in a very long time. Another huge improvement is how level design is handled. With Veilguard, Bioware has gone back to a more linear design that had always been better suited for them. And that change has allowed them to create better areas with just as much variety as any environment in Inquisition, but without the countless hours of padding. That's also certainly helped by the areas mostly being major hubs of activities, through faction quests and companion quests. Smaller side quests are also introduced in each area, and while the quality tends to vary in terms of memorability, that's a much more acceptable payoff when you spend an hour or less in one location for 3 or 4 missions at a time, rather than 8 or 9 traversing a massive area for the same amount of missions. I'm particularly a fan of what Dogtown offers, as its stories often mirror Nev's, offering mysteries abound and perhaps the darkest side plots in the entire game, including multiple investigations into the darker parts of Thedas' lore regarding magic. This, to me, is a return to form in a design that Bioware is just historically better with, as even Inquisition, in its later DLCs, went back to this type of design, and those stories offered perhaps the best level design of the entire game. That's not to say it's perfect. One of the biggest issues these side quests suffer from is a lack of any real choice. They're very linear, and you very, very rarely add anything of your own to their story structure. This is deeply disappointing, however not entirely surprising, as mini quests in Inquisition were very similar. On a more tactile note, the amount you can explore in each area is sometimes a bit arbitrary, often unlocked through various missions throughout the game. This wouldn't be an issue if there were indicators of where you can and can't go beyond the occasional dead end or blank blue barrier. The game also often makes a jump from a higher to lower place seem very possible, only to cause the screen to go back mid-jump and bring you back to where you were. Or more frustratingly, let you hit the ground and then go black and send it back to where you were. That aspect is most troublesome when an area overlooks another that is blocked off in later games, such as Arlothan Forest. This is, to me, the most annoying aspect of the core moment-to-moment gameplay. Although a close second is the new checkpoint system. In each area of the world, there are designated fast travel points that also serve as spawn points. If you save the game at any time and reload it, you won't start off where you left off, but instead be brought to the nearest checkpoint from the place that you saved. This is obviously a pretty common system, however in Dragon Age, the series has always allowed you to save in an exact location and continue from that spot. This is perhaps the most baffling change to me, as the other changes I can at least see the reasoning for or understand how we got to this point. However, this is so needless and unnecessary to me that I just can't wrap my head around it. It's not as if it would have been harder to implement something they've already done in this engine in other games, but I digress. One other gameplay aspect I greatly enjoy was the emphasis on character exploration. Each character in the Veilguard bring their own abilities into the field, allowing them to open otherwise unobtainable areas with things such as moving rocks, floating platforms, or a skill in sparking to life ancient technologies. This shines a light on each character, and is often thematically tied into who they are as a person, or the struggle they're facing throughout the story. I will posit one small but odd complaint, however, and that's the use of the Lyrium Dagger, an important plot item to the overall story, as a way to open these abilities when the specific ally needed isn't in the party. While this is a wonderful convenience, I do think it takes some of the emphasis off the characters. I think it might have been smarter to use these abilities more in personal and character-relevant missions, and instead emphasize these abilities out in the field while exploring as a way to open areas, forcing you to explore a bit more with each member of your group. The lack of a more old-school approval system in Veilguard decentivizes you from varying up your party as much as you might have in previous games, an issue made worse by how you can play most of the game without worrying about needing specific balance in your party composition, outside of perhaps assuring you have healing for high-level boss fights. Removing the Lyrium Dagger would have pushed you into varying your party more often. It's a small and unimportant complaint, and I'm certain if it was handled this way, there would be more complaints about that, but I do think it would have forced a level of variance that would have helped the overall focus of the game on its companions. There's been a lot said about the characters of Veilguard, and by and large it has not been positive. I feel within that there are criticisms that are fair to be made, especially in the opening hours when the voice acting is at its weakest. I have a theory that the first hours of the game and some of the opening companion conversations were recorded during the pandemic from home, as we have seen footage of some of the voice actors recording lines during that time. This is by far not a slight against the voice actors, by the way. I suspect both the combination of the stress of that period, juxtaposed with what must have been a nightmarish process of offering voice actors feedback, is why those first few levels of the game have such questionable line delivery, especially when you consider both Ballara and Nev seem awkward in those opening lines, and go on to deliver really good performances for the rest of the game. Editors note this does appear to be the case, as in a certain Bloomberg article we will talk about way later on, it is confirmed that the pandemic combined with the voice actor strike was what made it difficult to re-record entire lines. And to be honest, I'll take that in the hopes that the voice actors actually get paid what they're worth. I personally have a bit of a problem with the use of the term, "the writing is bad." It's not that I necessarily disagree in some elements. However, I very strongly feel this phrase is used to dismiss something rather than critique it. I'm not sure how you can explain bad writing in something with a whole team of writers without going into detail about where specifically it's bad. When you press someone who makes this complaint, often it feels like they're backpedaling to try to explain a point they don't quite know how to express. So if I'm going to make complaints about the writing in this video, I'd like to be very specific. For me, I think Veilguard has an issue with structure and wooden dialogue. I'll go into the first later, but in the case of the second, I do feel there is an issue with wooden and sometimes awkward dialogue, especially when transitioning in and out of a scene. Often, conversations feel disjointed, with the dialogue of a scene not necessarily matching your choices, and characters simply dismissing your statements in order to guide you back onto the path of the main dialogue structure without branching very far. This is a problem with the entire series, but is at its worst in Veilguard. The ends of conversations specifically tend to be awkward and unnatural, ending abruptly once the information needed is presented, and this doesn't help with the game's habit of lingering on a scene to watch Rook walk away fairly awkwardly before we fade to black. This leads to certain conversations feeling disjointed and wooden, and that's not the voice acting cast, as I do feel many of the companions' voice actors rise above this issue. This is purely a cinematic design issue. This isn't to dismiss where the writing is effective, as I feel several personal quests especially shine incredibly well, and that makes sense when you consider that these are likely where the writers are given the most freedom. I will, however, bring up a point when we're discussing wooden dialogue. Maybe we're romanticizing the quality of writing the series has offered in moment-to-moment conversations.
Looking for clues.
Ah, Hawk stepped in the poopy.
Now, you may feel taking that clip out of context is unfair to Dragon Age 2, and to that I say, yeah, you've got a great point. I wonder what that feels like. I have personally always felt that this series, and Bioware games as a whole, suffers from wooden dialogue, although perhaps not to this extent before. Specifically, the transition to a fully voice-acted player character has always been an incredibly awkward thing. Playing off of a random set of options that all have to be voice-acted, while also folding it into a conversation that can't branch out as much with a voiced cast, is a difficult thing to tackle. And I do feel the way most of these games have handled it have often come off disjointed. The quality of these variances differ, with a more grounded character like Hawk managing to flow in and out of choices fairly well, largely due to being more constrained. However, I would not in any way say the Inquisitor interacts with these branching dialogues in a better way than Veilguard, even if the actual tone indicators in that game were more accurate. Now, I will personally admit the dialogue wheel is indeed one that lacks a certain amount of depth of choice. When I first started the game, I genuinely thought this particular iteration of the wheel might be my favorite of the series. It takes the tone indicators that Inquisition brought in, and the varying locations on the dialogue wheel started by the previous game, and combines it by adding, but not overusing, some of the tone indicators of Dragon Age 2, and creates a wheel that allows for far more experimentation with far, far less moral implications behind the decisions like you would find in Mass Effect. That belief, however, was greatly challenged by the realization that much of the writing behind these choices are greatly unified in Branching Path. The dialogue wheel has been greatly stripped of any reaction that isn't in some way agreeable. There are certainly moments of emotional stress and even scenes where you can be aggressive with characters, but especially the latter is few and far between. While the dialogue wheel hosts what appears to be a wide array of options, what is actually said in many cases mirrors the tone of one another with little variance for what those tone indicators are supposed to imply, and that greatly tones down your ability to react to a situation differently upon subsequent playthroughs. To be fair, this does start to mirror a similar issue I had with Dragon Age 2. In some ways, Dragon Age 2 handles it far better, as it does feel like the Veilguard steps in and makes the choice on your behalf to be kinder and more caring to your companions and their struggles, in a way that your character is very much locked into personality-wise. The second game in the series offers 3 specific personalities, while most rooks will have very similar defining characteristics. Hawk's story allows for a grounded character with context, and context and history help inform good dialogue, as well as allowing for cutting wit. Rook's sarcastic dialogue, unfortunately, fails far more than it succeeds, often barely resembling sarcasm at all, and thus indicating the greater issue at hand.
So this blighted dragon just happens to lick its wounds near a bunch of wardens? Seems convenient. I don't trust it.
Huh?
So instead of one giant fight, we have a lot of smaller ones. I bet that won't make things any easier.
Huh?
Good question. Harding hasn't done anything bad, right?
Huh?
But for me personally, the wealth of choice in backgrounds and race make up for some of these issues. Now, even in this, it does fail in places, limiting players from headcanoning a rook that was a part of the Qun, for example, or a rook that was a city elf. It's a huge miss, especially when the developers were talking about how all headcanons would be supported in the game, which, would have always been a bold statement to make. But for my personal playthroughs, I was mostly supported in doing things like headcanoning my dwarven rook as growing up castless, and to be fair, I have not personally played either of the previous options yet, so these issues may not be as severe as reported. Despite these issues, the addition of all of these backgrounds, all of these different perspectives, allows you to build a far more unique character, and what that takes away from, for example, in Sharpness of Wit, to me it makes up for in background-related dialogue options. Whereas Hawk is guided along this 3-pronged journey regardless, Veilguard offers 6 backgrounds that add specific dialogue options, with 4 additional unique race-specific additions to them. Each background informs your journey to where the game starts, and even accounts for the more unusual combo choices, such as a Kunari member of the Mornwatch. These options add up to endless possibilities of unique character roleplay opportunities that are still hurt by the pre-personality choice of the game, yet still offer a level of variance that encourages new choices and playthroughs. As much as I wish this agreeability was a decision they didn't make, I'm far more willing to walk down the path of a pre-built, softer-hearted character with a huge variance in backgrounds over a specific background with 3 specific variances in personality. To me, that evens out. I know I, as a Dwarven player, felt overserved in the options afforded to me. Ever still, the game's insistence on speaking for you is an issue. This is an element that has bothered me ever since Bioware began voiced protagonists as a major element in their games. Mass Effect 3, in particular, very often gives you less conversation options than previous games, and I feel that decision infected every game that came after it. While Veilguard offers a wealth more options than the 2 previous games, they do inevitably say and do the same things, no matter the option, and the continuing trend of Bioware characters interjecting without your input does make this issue worse. This is a frustration of mine. However, personally, I play this subgenre of games specifically for the companions. Learning about them, getting to know them more, helping them with their troubles, that's the appeal of this subgenre to me. So I have trouble fully condemning the choice because it lines up with why I come to these games. Despite that, less choice and more overhead decision in an RPG is always a poor design decision, and the game is lesser for it. I genuinely feel, on the surface, this dialogue wheel is the best the series and Bioware has offered, so it's a particular frustration that the writing doesn't back it up. As we near us talking about the characters, I want to revert back to what I talked about at the beginning of this section. I, perhaps, am not the most unbiased person to be covering this game, and especially its characters. Through the process of making this video, the only other narrative game I've spent any serious time playing is my second playthrough of BG3, and that process helped me realize that I do, in fact, have a Veilguard bias. It is impossible to look at BG3 and its wealth of choice and not find Veilguard lacking in some way. Recognizing those faults, however, don't necessarily chase away my bias, and there's a very good reason for that. In order to explain it, I'd like to show you a clip from my first playthrough. When I started playing Veilguard, I made the decision to keep my PS5 controller mic open, specifically so that if something I really was interested in happened, I'd have audio of my reaction. This comes from a moment early in the game, and while you're going to have to forgive me as I attempt to balance the awful PS5 mic audio, I think it's important to have it here.
My brother.
What?
What?
Back there. You asked me why I did this.
Oh no.
Why I put myself out here. For him. For my brother. Wherever he is. Syrian. That was his name. We were the same, you know? In a lot of ways. We wanted to learn everything. About Elvenon, the magic, the people, all of it. We heard about the Notisterthalin, figured it had the answers, or some of them. Then Arlathan started going wrong. I joined the Veil Jumpers to help people, and he kept looking, kept putting himself in danger. It should have been safe. I know, I checked that artifact 3 times. I guess it should have been 4. Artifact started pulsing. He was too close. I couldn't find my way in. They called him a hero. Wanted to make a statue. They thought it would make it all okay. My little brother. He thought he needed to take care of me. He called me Vora Shivan. Hummingbird in Elven. Said it was because I could never sit still. But he loved me for it. Said it kept him thinking, trying to keep up. And he helped me too. He kept me focused, anchored. And now he's gone. Because I wasn't good enough.
It's not your fault. You have to know that.
Then why does it feel like it was?
Oh.
You lost someone important. Guilt's part of that. But if you don't learn to get past it, you'll drown.
I wish it were that easy. I've tried. Told myself I couldn't have done anything, and my head believes it. But my heart doesn't. So I try to make up for it. Honor him. Learn about our people. Find the truth. Maybe when I do, I'll feel it.
Feel what?
That he forgives me. And that I deserve it.
That was the best mission in the game so far.
It's not a particularly comfortable thing to share this clip, but I think it's necessary when talking about the characters. Hell, I think it's important to understanding this game as a whole, because Veilguard's overall thing, what the entire game revolves around, is grief. Bellara is a Veil Jumper, an incredibly talented technician of ancient elven artifacts, an invaluable member of a still-growing organization dedicated to uncovering that which the ancient elves lost and protecting the world from the ancient world's lingering side effects. Her peers respect her as a savant, unmatched within their organization. However, despite this, she also exists within a state of self-doubt and imposter syndrome. Despite her clear intelligence and excitement for her work, a level of anxiety has seeped into her work that's clear to see from the moment you meet her. Some of this lack of confidence comes from a place of grief, as this journey she began was not one she set out on alone. Bellara had a younger brother, one who helped give her that confidence, that was also brilliant and that helped foster her brilliance while keeping her grounded. And he was lost to an accident Bellara blames herself for. Bellara exists with a constant state of denied grief, wrestling with a guilt that has stunted her ability to heal and grow. The wound not closing and healing, but instead festering and infecting. And the world has done her no favors in finding that healing, as her guilt is now externalized and intertwined with the sight of her gods, those who hold domain both over her people and her work, returning to threaten the world and everything she loves, everything she has left. As the events that might well lead to the end of this world begin to pick up into a gale force intensity, Bellara is quickly forced to confront that her grief over her brother and her misplaced guilt over what her people might have been may well be interconnected.
You know what? I'm okay. Weirdly. Not amazing, not great, but okay. We found it. That connection. What Syrian and I were looking for. And now I have to live my life. That's all I can do, for either of us.
Making it from one day to the next is pretty tough some days. But we do it, and it's enough.
Right. One foot in front of the other. I don't know what our people's future looks like. But now they know their past, and they have a future. I hope you've found peace, wherever you are now. Dareth, Shural, and Ha Belanaris. Syrian, I love you.
Grief further intersects between these companions. Lace Harding, a minor character who served a major role in Inquisition, returns to serve next to Varric as the face of the organization, prepared to halt the start of this crisis they had both seen begin 10 years ago. Harding, a rather sweet but incredibly capable woman who formerly served as the lead scout for said Inquisition, quickly becomes a central figure, forced to carry the same weight she saw those she served under carry during the events of Inquisition. As the world changes violently around her, she herself goes through a sudden metamorphosis beside it, causing her to garner new magical abilities. Abilities that no dwarf, severed from the magic and their own dreams as they are, has ever seemingly had before. These abilities lead her down a path to uncover the mysteries of the dwarven people, reconcile her own separation from her culture as a surface dwarf, and come to grips with mysteries so ancient the more proper dwarves of Orzammar's histories are even unaware of. But it also forces her to confront herself. Although it's hard to see behind the forced smile she presents, Harding has had a difficult life, joining the Inquisition, a standing army that borders on a cult at the level she was at an extremely young age, and being pushed into a major role nearly immediately. Even after the end of Inquisition, she spent the majority of 10 years on the road with Varric, hunting leads for the organization. Lace Harding has not had a moment to slow down her entire adult life, and at the start of Veilguard, she is perhaps at her most emotionally raw, struggling with grief and anger, an aspect of herself she attempts to suppress, to not let be seen through the cracks in her armor, and something that, combined with her new mysterious abilities, could prove disastrous if the dam of her emotions finally breaks through the raw power of her new abilities and where they come from.
Look at me! Don't you remember? They broke us into a million pieces. And this is all that's left!
Anger. And pain. My anger and my pain.
You cast me out!
I couldn't bear it. I'm sorry.
If I turn from doing what's right, I'll lose myself.
Next, there's Emmerich, an older gentleman from Navarre's Grand Necropolis, a mass burial tomb that is as sacred to Navarran life as any Andrastian aspect of their culture. largely handled by necromancers who guide the dead to their grave and take care of those that might still wander with well-meaning spirits and cull those with malicious intent. Emmerich is one of the foremost magical minds and teachers within the infrastructure of Navarra's Mournwatch organization, and a respected scholar across the continent. He is something of a recluse, who spent most of his life within said underground, adopted at a young age after the early and tragic deaths of his parents, an event that has left him with a crippling fear of death that somewhat conflicts, yet works in unison, with his life's mission of caring for the dead. As Emmerich leaves the necropolis to join you, he begins to see the world outside of his own surprisingly sheltered life underground, and comes in touch with vast, grand experiences he'd never even thought to indulge in before due to his devotion to his work, and ones that challenge that fear of mortality he's always had. Perhaps more than that, with the Veilguard he finds a connection he's perhaps been missing all his life, a personal experience with friends and perhaps family, unlike what he's been used to in the academic world of the Grand Necropolis. The world of academia is not kind to the few friendships that Emmerich has, and the person most visible in Emmerich's life isn't a person, but instead a spirit, a wisp in a skeletal body, one that Emmerich has grown close to and embraced their natural curiosity to help get used to the world. And that skeleton's name is Manfred, and I kind of hate him. I hate playing rock, paper, scissors with him. He beats me most of the time, and for the love of God, stop throwing paper when I throw paper, for the love of God! Sorry. Anyway, this brings him even further into conflict with his fear of his own mortality, as the option for a far extended life does await him, should he take a dangerous path as a keeper of the necropolis itself. But on the other side of that decision lies an Emmerich very unlike who he is now, and the possibility of a very sudden death. As he moves forward and grapples with those that might use the magic he has fostered for evil, he is also forced to confront those that grew up beside him, who were more willing to challenge the odds than he was, and be forced to face the ultimate reward for his years of service and decide whether the sacrifice necessary to protect all that he's known is worth the life he wants to live and the uncertainty that comes with that life.
Ah, hello there. Just admiring how carefully the Fade is woven into this place, as cultivated as a palace garden.
That's old elven stuff for you. Magic everywhere you look, and also where you don't.
I do envy you, Rook.
Really?
I can only imagine what you got up to as one of the fabled crows of Antiva. Not to mention traveling with Varric, the adventures you've already had. Work was always my excuse not to travel, but now that I've joined you, I'm finally exploring outside Navarra's crypts. Ah, speaking of the necropolis.
Yes?
I've been meaning to ask how you'd like your body prepared in the event of your death.
Then there's Nev, an incredibly capable, self-reliant detective who has patrolled and helped watch out for Minrathous' Dogtown all her life. Nev is originally brought on to aid Rook and the others with the inner workings of Minrathous and to stop the direct threat of the ritual that opens the game. However, her remaining with the group as things grow more and more complicated puts her in a position she's rarely in. Nev is a loner. She's a product of a part of Minrathous that is ignored and forgotten. Used and abused for labor by the upper echelons of Tevinter, perpetually stepped on and always forgotten when the people are actually in need. This is an experience that has hardened her and left her both cynical and untrusting. Her love for her city exists in spite of this, her hope for the future tinged with the hardened yet realistic fear that Minrathous, and the world at large, would not bat an eye let alone shed a tear if her neighborhood was destroyed. That makes Nev realistic, self-reliant, and aloof to those that don't know her. However, that aloof nature is a defense mechanism. If she were to let people in, they would see how very afraid she is to let her guard down, even for a second, because her life has reminded her over and over again that to let anyone in, to trust, is equivalent to death, and the end of the world will either prove her wrong, or just show how very right she is. In the end, Rook's role in her life has the potential to heal this cynicism and allow her to become truly trusting of another person. Or Rook has the ability to send Nev into the ultimate extreme of cynicism and become a far more hardened protector of her home.
Joining Varric, us. Do you really wish you'd said no?
No. I just have a bad habit of picking jobs that go sideways. You think I'd learn, but those gods escaped. Not much of a win. And if the world falls, the city goes too. It's not like I'll find work then.
Is that why you said yes? To save Minrathous?
People will tell you Minrathous is broken, and they're right. It's corrupt, petty. Saving the world won't fix it. I take the small wins, Rook. Hal serving fish another day, getting past the next scrape alive. Sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes you get more. But the tables always turn. It's better if you know it's coming.
But fighting the gods is not a journey that can only be handled by 5 people. There's Davrin, a Dalish man that left his people in order to find a higher calling, eventually finding himself within the heroic, yet somewhat shady Grey Wardens. Tasked with the protection of the very last griffins the Wardens and all of Thedas has left, Davrin is forced to become the shepherd of that one isolated griffin, rescue those that are in danger, as well as slowly come to terms with the meaning and value of his own life outside of the romanticized end he has given himself. His worth doesn't have to be defined by what he carves out of himself. Instead, maybe his life can be defined without a social currency, and that his life is gift enough to the world.
Why is being alive a problem?
Because I didn't expect to be here. Grey Wardens have an expiration. It pushed me.
There's more fight to go.
And if we manage to pull that off?
You'll do what you do best. Hunt monsters.
Plenty of people can do that. I'm talking purpose. I feel like a blade sharpened all these years to confront the worst darkness in the world. And my blade struck true at Weishaupt. What now?
Beyond Davrin, there's Lucanus, an Antivan Crow meant for great things, held captive for over a year by a sect of Venatori and tortured throughout, forced to unnaturally combine with a demon of spite, a union that causes Lucanus to constantly suffer and doubt himself. And yet, spite is the encapsulation of what years of solitary confinement has done to Lucanus. Once he's free, he's obsessed with work, obsessed with revenge, obsessed with any distraction that might make what happened to him feel lighter on the soul. Anything to not internalize what he went through. Anything to keep him from thinking about the ramifications of what he has become.
I don't know what I thought it would be like. Getting out of the ossuary. Getting my life back. If this is my life now, I'll take it.
Finally, there's Tosh, a quickly rising Kunari dragon hunting expert who has lived a very sheltered life under the thumb of their very, very traditional ex-Kun mother, who has attempted to impart on her child a very Kunari lifestyle, despite her choice years ago to flee with them to Ravane at a young age. Tosh, an adult now, garnering respect and even admiration, is now forced to confront their own identity through terms they never knew growing up in such a secluded environment, as well as their tug-of-war between Kunari and Ravani life, and what all of these forces mean about who they are and who they want to be, which is an incredibly relatable experience. And get behind me, Tosh, I will protect you from this YouTube clickbait bullshit! Okay, maybe I came in a little hot, but you thought I was going to shit on them, didn't you? I don't know, I think it's a little weird that every single Veilguard critical video on this website seems to have Tosh at the front of it, the only visible non-binary rep in this game, or most games right now. But what do I know? I'm just a person that notices things and patterns and such.
Wait, look at that. Ropes.
Qunari ropes. The Antam. They're the ones who've been blighting the dragons for the gods. Those ropes. They tie her down with these ropes so they can blight her. They turn her into something blighted and ugly and wrong. Something she was never supposed to be. Chakra Toebra. I've got to be ready to fight her. I'm a dragon slayer.
Tosh.
I'm a crappy Qunari. I'm not really Ravani. I'm no good as a daughter. I can't even be a woman right. I have to be a dragon slayer.
Tosh, I know what you're going through right now. Sometimes stuff gets, I don't know, all twisted up. You get angry because it's easier than facing what's really there. Because what's really there feels too big. You are not blighted, or ugly, or wrong. If you feel like you are, it's only because there's something you need to face.
My mother put these ropes on me. She tied me up. Why did she do that? Is it because I didn't fit as a woman? Is it why I don't fit as a woman?
Oh, Tosh.
The Shadow Dragons say there are people who use they instead of he or she. They're not men or women. And I like how it feels when I imagine myself that way. But I'm not supposed to breathe fire. Am I not supposed to feel like this? What does she want me to be?
Anyway. All of these characters, indeed all of the major characters in Veilguard, are dealing with grief in some way, shape, or form. The game's core story themes are the various stages of grief. Grief for those lost, grief for those you failed, grief for who you thought you were and what you stood for, grief for how a system systemically abuses and isolates the ones you love, grief for how identity can alienate you from the people that are supposed to love and support you, and grief over the catastrophic decisions one can make and how that grief can lock you into an endless cycle of trying to undo it and hurting even more people. At its best, Veilguard takes that grief and forces you to sit in it, to bond with others and heal and grow from it, or at the very least, stand side by side with those that understand that deep, gnawing feeling of grief. And I do really find that beautiful and stirring. And that is a particularly effective theme for me to see a Dragon Age game focus so heavily on. And the reasons for that go far deeper than I was willing to admit when I first started writing this script. If you'll forgive me for the detour, I'd like to take a step away from my coverage of Veilguard long enough to explain why this cast of characters works so specifically well for my own life experiences and my love for this series. I mentioned earlier in the video that my mother loved Dragon Age. She started playing it during a time where I'd stopped playing as many games, as I'd just survived life-saving and altering surgery, not only had very little time for anything that took a significant amount of focus, but also would leave me in varying stages of being flat broke for the rest of my life. Shortly before my surgery, my mom, who was also disabled, started to play some of my 360 games and fell in love with Fable 2. Not Fable, mind you, she hated that game for some reason, but she'd played both the sequels all the time. Like, to such an extent that it wasn't uncommon to see her grinding minigames for money in the Bowerstone Tavern for hours on end. I started to introduce her to other games since I wasn't playing them anyway, and the only other series that really stuck was Dragon Age. I remember she'd always play a Kuzland and always romance Alistair. I've since discovered that replaying the same world state again and again and again is apparently a family trait. I know I do it all the time, so apparently I inherited it from her even though I played the game first. Sorry. I remember I'd always fight the big fights for her, She had difficulty with them, but I remember her beating the broodmother herself once and being so proud. She also played DA2, although I'm ashamed to say I'm not really sure who she romanced. I remember her crying at one particular scene, and it wasn't until many years later that I realized exactly what scene that was and why she cried during it.
As much or as little as you want. No one tells you how to mourn. And when someone says, move on, you take their hand and say, my choice.
There are a few experiences I've had like that with various things. Now, the one game I took time to get and play during this multi-year off time I had from gaming was Inquisition. And I tried to set it up so that she could play it too, but the keep confused her quite a lot, and I felt I couldn't help her without her playing the series again for herself, as I had bad enough brain fog and enough time away from the series to not remember all of the decisions myself. She never did that replay. Midway through the pandemic, my mom passed away from cancer. It was a cancer she'd suffered from for over 2 years, and likely longer, as I'd been helping her on a day-to-day basis since I, myself, was finally getting back on my feet. We were both still disabled and both struggling to survive, and we leaned on each other a lot during that period. After my mom passed, I took solace in gaming a lot more, mostly because I had time for it again. I played Inquisition for the second time around this time, and I truly believe that might as well have been my first playthrough I ever made of the game, as I was not in the right headspace to play it the first time around. And it also reminded me of the failure that had been my attempt to get her to play the game too. This return to gaming brought me back to the Dragon Age fandom, a place where I felt comfortable on the internet. And now, with this newest entry, the game heavily focuses on the same elements that rekindled my love of the series, and the grief that I have suffered for the last nigh on 5 years. In a way, it's been healing to me to go back to the franchise my mom loved as much as I did, and see it through to a natural end I think she would cry at the way I did. And that's why I think this is such a complicated topic for me. I think this theme is lost or missed on so many people. To not recognize the theme is to miss half of the entirety of the game, because the whole of it is built around collective grief, and how one moves on and heals from it. And I think that's at least partially why the dismissal of those companions bothers me so damned much, and why I have such a hard time presenting the game in an unbiased way. I see what it was trying to do, and I was the target audience for it, and that meant something to me. Okay, that was heavy. Hopefully I can get us back on track, but I'm equally hopeful that whatever I say from here, it's understood that I do have a very personal connection to this game, regardless of any criticisms I might level at it from this point forward. And I hope it becomes clear that my personal connection to it doesn't necessarily change the thesis of this video. It just explains why I'm so devoted to an understanding of it. I have an extremely complicated relationship with how the world of Thedas and the story structure of this game are both handled. On one hand, as with all things regarding this game, I feel it is both misunderstood and overhated. A good example of this is that one Tosh scene that's actually a pretty good descriptor of a fairly common aspect of the trans experience, but I digress. This is to say that many aspects of Veilguard are often both overcriticized and unreflective of the actual experience of the game. I think part of the reason the companions get so much hate is how the story structures itself around them and solely around them. This game doesn't offer you the option to have casual conversations with your allies, so in lieu of taking on the companions at your own pace, the plot guides you more rigidly in order to get to know them, thus making a huge portion of Veilguard's story structure be focused on aiding your companions, rather than that content being set aside from the main story. I think this is both a strength and a weakness of the game, as it allows you to get invested in very long story arcs, whereas in past games it often felt like a character's entire story could be fit into less than an hour of the game, and Veilguard instead offers far more tactile interactions with both the companions and their stories. But that also means if you don't jive with a character, you're going to be spending far more time with them than you might wish to. I know for many players this process left them feeling disconnected from the party as a whole. However, for me personally, this new approach was a huge highlight. In Inquisition, so much of your early game time is spent having conversations without facial animations for 10 or 15 minutes at a time while trying to get the camera just right, and that choice in design made it very hard for some to focus on the actual content of the conversation, regardless of the high quality of said content. Here, their story is a constant focus, and when it's not told to you through storyline quests, it's also given to you casually at the lighthouse. You're offered brief views into the characters while walking past them, watching them interact with one another in between missions, and gleaming more about their characters and relationships with the other companions than you would normally otherwise. To be clear, this isn't a new design decision, as companion banter has always been a highlight of the series throughout its long history. However, in the past, this kind of content was locked behind actually taking specific combinations of companions out into the field together multiple times, and that meant you inevitably simply wouldn't get all of these interactions, especially between characters that overlapped in party composition. In Veilguard, their interactions at the lighthouse supplement what might have been lost, and makes the characters and their inter-party dynamics very clear. While I would prefer something like Origins, where you can talk to your companions at any time and engage with their stories at your own pace while also being able to actually see them, it's clear they've been moving away from this being a feature since as far back as DA2, and if it's going to be gone, I do prefer this method. But this does make this a complicated game if someone doesn't like the characters, as the emphasis of the game is its characters. There is no opt-out, you do not have a choice, you are all hands on deck for their stories, and you are forced into the position to aid them and offer kindness regardless of choice. If you aren't fully engaged with the stories, or at least some of the characters, you're going to have a difficult time with this game, as there isn't much else here to explore. But that also is the game's biggest strength. At the end of the game, you will know these companions. You'll spend a significant amount of time with them and invested yourself into them in a way you could easily miss in previous games, and that, despite its flaws, is the point of this series. Companions are the secret ingredient that brings people to Bioware games again and again and again. They're the beating heart of them, and I personally think this design philosophy is a natural extension of that. That design decision, however, does play into the greatest core issue with the game, and that's just how badly paced and structured it is. Major plot choices are a mixed bag in Veilguard. However, I do feel when they're done well, they are done extremely well. The best example of this is the first major choice you make in the game, as that one specific choice vastly changes the quests and resources you'll have at your disposal for the rest of the game. This is perhaps one of my favorite decisions in the entire series, as it forces you to make a decision based on your gut that will have untold consequences, with very little information in a very short amount of time. It's very difficult to make a choice that can stall you into hesitancy, and they pulled it off in a way I haven't often seen these games manage to do. This one decision changes the entire rest of the game, locking you off from some faction-related content, changing entire environments, and putting you on the back foot in building trusting relationships. But it doesn't just lock you out of content, as your choice opens an entirely new branch of quests. And while you do lose swaths of quest content on the opposite side you didn't choose, you gain in exchange a few new and unique ones. This is an impressive and difficult feat to achieve, to add such wildly branching paths through the game that early in the story, and that's why I can't help but question the common talking point that this game is limited in terms of choice. Now, I'm not saying that the game has that level of choice elsewhere, and it does feel limited in terms of major decisions, but the fact that there is such a massive decision that early in the game is an incredible feat that I think is being too often overlooked. It is, understandably, incredibly common in this series for a major narrative choice to be made early in the game, and to have that not affect the rest of the game, with the exception of a post-game slide. That does not happen in Veilguard, and that should be applauded. That brings us to a subject that I both believe is true of this game, and yet am most frustrated with the fan interpretation of where it goes wrong. Let me give you an environmental example of my frustration on this. One of the areas of the game that sticks out to me most is where Nev takes you on your second visit to Docktown. Appropriately, it's one of the many docks in town. Oh god, did I really write that? and one that Nev visits fairly regularly to buy food from her favorite seafood stand, an incredibly humble pop-up that could only exist in such an impoverished area. The stand is right next to a fairly popular tavern that people from the entire city visit, and it's one of the few places you'll go where you'll see very clearly wealthy denizens talking in all of Docktown. One of these denizens talks about donating money from her allowance, while the other rolls her eyes and makes centrist, snarky comments about how it's a waste of time to care so much. But if you walk around the area, you'll find there's more guards here than anywhere in Docktown except maybe the local chantry, and interestingly, both of these wealthy citizens have 3 whole guards surrounding just them alone. On the flip of that coin, dock workers litter the entire area, and if you walk just far enough, you'll find an inaccessible area with 2 guards and caged doors, where a slew of people stand in tight corners, implied to be indentured servants in between work. This is a harrowing thing to notice, and excellent environmental storytelling. It tells you just how dire and ingrained slavery is within the system, and how so many explain it away. This is something that isn't an uncommon sight around Docktown. With its many caged doors and carts, and beleaguered and overworked servants moving from job to job everywhere, the impression you're left with is that this area, one we're told repeatedly is impoverished and forgotten, is not only a major place of indentured working conditions, but also likely where the indentured servants who did work through their years of servitude and came out the other end up stuck in. Free, but still separate from the rest of Minrathous society, trapped in the same limitations they once had while indentured. This is, to me, Veilguard's environmental storytelling at its very best. It's a clear, bold statement on the harsh realities of a society that is built on slavery, but hides behind the mask of indentured servitude being somehow an ethical form of it. Throughout the game, you are forced to stare these same denizens in the eyes and watch as they become the first victims of anything going even slightly wrong in Minrathous. It's an absolutely heartbreaking section of the game to repeatedly visit, and becomes downright harrowing depending on your choices and the events of the world as a whole. Which is why it's curious that Docktown is the primary subject of a bigger complaint with Veilguard, one that I actually agree with, but on a second playthrough, simply cannot directly agree with this being the primary example of. Docktown is often used to present the game as a completely politically bereft entry in the series, one that is afraid to touch on the topics of its world. And to be clear, I do think this is an issue with Veilguard, but I find Docktown being the tip of the spear for that argument to be unusual. Before I even engage, I do raise an eyebrow at the game for making the subject of slavery be a focus without actually including the perspectives of those that were, enslaved. I not only find that to be a huge miss, but also a critical, disturbing failure. That said, the argument you often see is that Veilguard avoided the slavery topic entirely, and while it's true it's not heavily interacted with directly by the plot, it's so clear that the entire setting of Minrathous is meant to be built around how insidious and vile the slavery system of Tevinter is, that I simply can't stand by that statement. The conversation especially doesn't add up for me when you realize that the only overt political choice you make the entire game, the one that seriously shakes up the future of Thedas like in previous entries, is in the Minrathous arc. It is the only time in the game you're asked to actually engage with the political realities of Thedas. Now, again, I think it's far from perfect. I am deeply disappointed with the fact that the affluent are ultimately those that decide the fates of an enslaved nation. But Docktown is an arc that does engage with its world building in a way that the rest of the game absolutely does not. I'll be honest, there is a part of me, just based on the research I've done for this video and the history of Dragon Age as a whole, that wonders if the environmental storytelling of Docktown is so specifically strong because Bioware told the team to avoid making this arc more specifically about the slave trade and the Shadow Dragon's inherent existence being about, freeing slaves. But even if that's the case, despite Docktown's very clear statement, it really was not enough to engage with this topic. It was more than the rest of the game, but it wasn't enough. With that statement being made, if we're being fully honest here, the question to me is, if we did get that arc so overtly in the game, do you really think a bunch of white Canadian liberals were going to have the tact to handle that arc with the care and attention to detail it would have needed. Because I don't. I think part of the reason people miss this is because huge aspects of the Minrathous arc can be missed depending on your choices in the game. When you take the overt political aspects of the Shadow Dragons arc out of the game, you very quickly begin to realize that the political depth of the rest of the game is incredibly lacking, bordering on non-existent. The Treviso arc, the parallel to Minrathous, and perhaps one of the 3 or 4 biggest in the entire game, is a perfect example of this. One thing I heard a lot about this game, and the Crows in particular, is that the faction has been retconned out of its horrid practices, as described by Zevran in games past, in order to present them as swashbuckling agents of freedom. I sympathize with this reading, and even agree with it. However, if you look into the details and codexes of Treviso, the home base of the Crows, you do begin to see the troubling history of the organization. This is an issue with Veilguard as a whole, allowing background information to tell the more harrowing stories while keeping the main plot a bit cleaner. Now I will say, I don't think it was an accident that a huge aspect of this arc is the violent revenge of a teenager that is also featured in the final battle of the story. That is classic Crows. I'm just not sure if the tone matches that story, but suffice it to say this is not so much a retcon as a shift of focus for this game specifically. This change in direction is troubling and worsens the entire experience of the faction. Since Dogtown does delve into the more direct political statements and decisions, rightfully the Crows, that story's parallel, should offer the same level of choice. But that simply is not the case. Not only does the Crow arc not offer you a way of exacting tangible change on Treviso or Antiva as a whole, but it goes out of its way to demonize local government and gives you no real choice in choosing the Crows over all else. And while this isn't bad on its surface, when a lot of your players are going to have this arc as the main focus, removing a major choice entirely to demonize the local government and the Antom in favor of offering a counter to the Crows, an assassination sect with a deeply checkered past and even checkered present, is disappointing and completely one note. There's no player choice to be found here. It is deeply, deeply linear. While I think the statement that the Crows are just swashbuckling heroes in Veilguard is limiting to the issue at hand, the focus on them being the only force that can save Treviso is both disappointing to the concept of the faction, and a huge amount of the game focused on linearity over choice. I wish there were options, even if that choice wasn't Crow or anti-Crow. Instead, we're left with nothing to do except follow the pre-chosen story in a series where choice is everything. The Antom and Qunari as a whole are another major failing of this game, and perhaps to me, its greatest failing. The Dragon Age series has always had a troubling relationship with Qunari. Repeatedly, the writers have fallen into the trap of making the Qunari racist caricatures. That failure continued to happen even when there were shifts in perspective or offerings of greater insight into their culture and the code they live by. It felt like each entry, the writers were at least trying to offer a nuanced take, but failing at every turn. Disappointingly, Veilguard might be the worst of the lot. The Qun as a whole is not truly engaged with in this game, despite the Antom, its army, being at war with large swaths of northern Thedas. The Antom separating from the Qun is something that was hinted at in the previous game. However, here, there's very little explanation given outside of codexes, and there is no engagement with why this would happen on a cultural level, or the perspectives of the Antom as, say, Dragon Age 2 handled the Qunari occupation. That's not to say Dragon Age 2 handled the Qunari occupation particularly well either, because it wasn't, but at least you engaged with it there. Instead, the Qunari are used largely as faceless enemies, an evil force for the player character to defeat while helping save cities from unmemorable and rather wooden two-dimensional villains. The Antom's motivation isn't well explained, and even in codexes, when you read through their break from the greater Qun, their reasoning doesn't necessarily match with their actions, serving as an arm of the God's army very arbitrarily. Since their goal seems to be doing what the Qun refuses to do, you would at least think they'd follow the Qun and not get involved with gods and high magic, but that's not what happens here. While the game does a good job of explaining why, say, the Venatori would side with the gods, the Antom are very one-dimensional villains whose motivations are murky, and sometimes even separate entirely from the Ontom's occupation's goal as a whole. This is especially troubling, as a game released in 2024 somehow manages to make the Qunari more of a racist caricature as a game released in 2011. And to be clear, DA2 does other the Qunari quite a lot, and Damn the Qun also quite a lot, but you engage with them, which is slightly better than faceless enemies. It's a deeply problematic and disappointing way to write the Ontom into the greater plot, and could have been so easily avoided. And this does leak down into other aspects of the story. Tasha's personal journey with identity, which I think is handled well in most cases, is troubled by this particular aspect, as Tasha's story with identity is needlessly hurt by this need to conflate their identity with the Qun in a negative way. The Qun or their Ravani culture should not be an aspect in play in terms of their identity. It is a needless negative conflation that proves the problem with the Ontom in the game as a whole. The Ontom are very much a hand-waving of other possible, more complicated antagonistic factions that could have happened in the game. And choosing to separate them from the Qun at all, let alone how that was done, is a massive, massive setback in an already troubling history of handling the Qunari. Another troubling and striking decision is how the game rarely explores how the Veil Jumpers and the Dalish as a whole react to their ancient gods, now very much real, returning to the world and wreaking war upon it. The Veil Jumpers, an organization that is not purely Dalish, still remains the only Dalish representation in the game, an unusual decision based on how heavily the focus in this game is on Elven culture. This was a major plotline the events of Inquisition went out of its way to set up, and its impact on the Dalish is hardly touched upon. It has bearing on Balara's story, which is good, but it's only ever viewed through the lens of guilt for what her gods were and how it affects her. This way of approaching the situation feels off to me. The Elven gods canonically abuse their people and force them into slavery, and the Dalish are just as much victims of that as anyone. For the game to only ever broach this issue from this perspective borders on irresponsible to me. This strange way of handling the ancestors of victims of abuse is also mirrored in another major storyline with a returning character, and it's sort of a problem that this was a repeated mistake of the storytelling. Strangely, I think the Grey Wardens are the best handled faction. An organization that was demonized in the second and third games are given a rather balanced view of the organization as imperfect and borderline dangerous, which isn't untrue, but also lacked the nuance Origins had built for the organization. In this game, there's a concerted effort to attempt to balance the troubled history of the Wardens with a possible future beyond the Blight that both recognizes the sacrifices made up to this point and respects them, while also identifying just where the Wardens went so very wrong in their rush to halt the Darkspawn and the Blights. This middle-of-the-road journey through the events of the game will reshape the Wardens forever and is very impactful and paid off the series as a whole. It is, however, a bit of an issue that the major choice you make during their biggest questline might be the worst major choice in the entire series, one bordering on useless to the actual events at hand. This is not the norm for the game, but it certainly is a major miss in what otherwise might have been one of the most memorable missions of the entire game. Despite that, I feel the Wardens are handled incredibly well, and it almost feels like a natural conclusion to the organization's story is reached throughout the game, respectful of its past while also critical of its existence. This, like Minrathous, is handled with care. All of these faction storyline arcs are connected with your background, so that you are tied into the events of the game. Unfortunately, very few of these backgrounds have a true effect on the plot. Most of these factions feel like a backdrop rather than something that leads to major choices where you affect change upon your faction, and I find that disappointing. Reaction-wise, the Shadow Dragons and Antivan Crows are the two organizations that feel as if you're taking part in the greater scheme of events, but only one of those two have you making decisions like what you'd find in, say, Inquisition or Origins. For as much as I can praise some of the big choices in this game as a step up, I think the lack of more tangible choices among each faction is a step backward that I personally find disappointing. I wish you had a choice to shift Antivan politics in a more varied way other than just reinstating the Crows. I wish there was a central conflict that allowed you to more closely interact with the politics of the Necropolis and Navarre as a whole. I wish you had a more active role in the future of the Wardens. I wish the Veil Jumpers had a tangible connection to the actual Dalish tribes, so that the fascinating lore of the Dalish and Tevinter and Ravain could play a part in the story and your choices. I wish that the Lords of Fortune had anything to do with the major plot. The Minrathous arc, despite what people may say, is the only arc in the game that feels like it harkens back to the same feeling as previous games, where Thedas' lore and politics were at the front of everything you did. And the few times you get that same feeling in this game are with the sections of the plot some players will never get the chance to interact with. Origins and Inquisition allowed you to be a player in that change, and if you weren't a player, you were at least a witness with a thumbprint upon it. You had agency. Dragon Age 2 allows you to be a witness caught up in the whirlwind of that change, not the arbiter of some of the change, but someone with a huge role in that change. Veilguard, in the vast majority of cases, has you be a neutral presence in the future of Thedas, an outlier on its political intrigue, and with the loss of that aspect falls one of the last unifying descriptors of the series. In previous games, you couldn't be a centrist to the political realities of the fascinating setting of Thedas. You had to have an opinion always. In Veilguard, those aspects might not be totally gone. I'm telling you, please engage closely with the realities of Minrathous. But they are downplayed and sometimes even hidden. Dragon Age's greatest strength has always been forcing fans to be downright radical in their views of Thedas' world as a whole, and Veilguard presents none of that fervency. As a note, this is just my gut speaking, but based on what I know both about this series and the development cycle of this game, I don't think this attempt to sidestep these issues was necessarily just the writing team's decision. I have a strong suspicion that the combination of the game losing so many project leads, and just how much expectation was put onto the shoulders of this game by Bioware and EA, that it's no accident that this was the game that was most hesitant to interact overtly with the underlying politics of Thedas. I could easily be wrong about that, but creating this video and seeing the conditions which each game was made within has very much birthed this suspicion within me, and it's one I can't shake. This to me is also reinforced by the original drafts of the Joplin version of Veilguard, as it deals more heavily in the elements set up by Inquisition, as well as brings Tevinter slavery and Elven uprising much more to bear. And having seen the original pitches, I don't think it's a coincidence that this version of the game never happened. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Joplin left right after it. Again, I could be wrong, but my gut tells me there's a reason why none of this seemed to enter the full game. I'm not going to get into details on how I feel about the Joplin script. I feel Veilguard does some things way better, and I feel the Joplin script does other things better. Although I feel the Joplin script isn't fully put together. It's more of an outline, really. But regardless of my own feelings, I don't think it's a coincidence that the more politically overt version of the game that would match what you expected out of Inquisition didn't happen. To me, at least, it just feels like anyone that was going to write major plot lines for this game were going to be hampered to some extent by either direct overhead tampering, or at the very least risk their own jobs. The releases and hell, the history of the series makes me think that there was a lot of creative clashing between the writers and the studio, and likely explains a lot of the writer turnover. I could be totally wrong about this, but in the event that I'm right, I am greatly impressed by what they did slip through the cracks. If this is true, Dogtown's design to me is a miracle. But if for some reason I'm wrong, and this is all a specific choice by the writers, I would say not nearly enough was done. I just strongly suspect that this is not the writers were bad problem, like the internet wants the game's failings to be boiled down to. There is too much proof of how Bioware and EA move for me to believe that the people who had their nose to the ground trying to make the game work for nigh on 10 years are the sole arbiters for everything wrong with a AAA title from a company in dire danger of being folded. History proves that at the best of times, oversight in Bioware has tampered with the vision of these games over and over again. Now, with all of that being said, I also feel the writers should receive harsh criticism for how these elements were put into play, and the racism baked into their decisions. This game was buffed at every corner to present something squeaky clean, and yet it somehow rivals the worst aspects of Thedas' racist writing, which is a flabbergasting mistake to have been made when so much of the game appears to have been made to avoid problems exactly like this. For all of the blame the team is actually getting, it's the handling of the Antom and the dismissal of the Dalish, and yes, despite my comments, the actual lack of slaves in the arc about freeing slaves that should land solely on their laps. It should be noted, and it should be repeated over and over again, that many of these elements are foundational issues with the setting of Thedas. But that setting was introduced to the world 15 years ago, and there's no excuse to still be fumbling it this badly. You set out to create the most inclusive game of the series, and you failed that mark by miles. I appreciate the queer representation, but you fail literally everywhere else. And to be super clear, as is going to become apparent in the rest of the video, I do not condone any harassment of this team, and I think some of y'all are nasty for how you've treated them, especially as they're victims of a Thresher maw of corporate crunch. But that criticism, I think, should be one they are forced to sit with, no matter the circumstances. This is the fundamental failing of Veilguard. I think the narrative disconnect that can hit the hardest in the game is the way the story is structured. There are multiple places in the game where the writing fails to push the plot forward in a natural way, feeling far too, for a desperate lack of a better phrase, I'll use one I hate, video gamey. The narrative structure of the game focuses heavily on companion quests, and that's not a bad thing at all. When you enter a Bioware game, that comes with the territory, that's the focus, that's a huge appeal, and that emphasis is a plus in my book for Veilguard. The problem occurs with how the story structure moves between acts, especially in the late second half and opening third. As the story hurtles towards its climax, the story structure of the game grinds to a repeated halt so that you can continue the companion side quests in an attempt to get them fully focused on the matter at hand. This isn't unusual, as one of Bioware's most lauded games, Mass Effect 2, a game Veilguard clearly borrowed heavily from for this entry, does the same. The issue, however, is that Mass Effect 2 is structured with a lesser looming threat, so that getting everyone on the same page is not only a necessity, it's the main driving force of the entire goal of the game. The Reapers aren't invading the galaxy yet, and while the human colonies are in trouble, it's a lower threat, a mystery that needs to be carefully solved by getting the right people together to work toward that goal, and assure that they're of sound mind to contribute the most they can toward that goal and survive. You need to prepare in order to get the best out of them, and that requires upgrades and getting a rather haggard and motley crew on the same page, fully focused on getting the job done and surviving. Veilguard has a plot that doesn't support this structure. The gods are a constant threat from very early in the game, so taking time for companion quests repeatedly every act does feel like it slows the momentum and breaks some level of suspension of disbelief. With that kind of looming threat, the story repeatedly telling you that you need to take a break in a way too direct way without a greater hook to make it a little less clear that this is a video game saying it's time to do a companion quest, feels jarring and a little disconnected from the world-threatening happenings of the game. It is a deeply inelegant way of moving the story forward, and verisimilitude does suffer for that, especially when every major event is waiting specifically for you to solve the troubles of your friends so as not to inconvenience you. This is a problem that is most jarring in the late game, with haphazard halts and restarts that repeat multiple times in very jarring messes. There are moments in the game where the cohesiveness of the plot is challenged by seemingly conflicting events, suppressed tone in moments of high stress, and haphazard structure that can cause you to double-take in the face of events at hand. And while that's understandable for a number of reasons, from poor implementation to the amount of writers that work on these projects, it might even be complicated by firing swaths of your staff mid-production, I'm just saying, it's a disappointing weakness of the game that hurts the otherwise very positive additional focus on companions. I think this shift was good and offers a ton of fantastic moments. It's just at the end of the day, it's not especially well integrated with the overall picture of the game. It is frustrating, sometimes, to watch the inter-party conflict be solved without proper narrative focus. That doesn't mean there isn't conflict, as there are multiple companions threatening to kill Lucanus in the early acts of the game based on his abomination status, uncomfortableness with the whole party in regards to Emmerich's necromancy, and interpersonal frustrations with the party's failures. But these do fade into the background fairly quickly, and it sometimes feels like these issues that needed a proper event to overcome just fade out into characters having buried their differences too easily. It's a very mature way of handling things, but it's not always narratively fulfilling. This is especially jarring at one point when a character in your party has every reason to be rightly furious with you as the player character, and instead of that being challenged, it simply fades into the background, present in how that character acts, but not necessarily in your ultimate relationship to them. It's treated as this too shall pass, but it's not a satisfying way to watch it pass. You're angry with me, I see it, you're allowed to be angry, I give you permission. There are times within the game where I genuinely feel the level of emotional maturity the game offers hurts these companions' characterizations, as even when they have every reason to be angry with you, their anger simmers down to a boil and is something to internally deal with rather than work through with the person at fault. I do very strongly feel there were several missed opportunities to add depth to the cast by actually forcing them into a level of reasonable conflict over things that mean so very much to them, and avoiding that conflict, I think, is yet another sign of the game's repeated issues with engaging in depth directly. And yet, I still think this structure adds something that the rest of the series lacks. A group of companions that actually feel cohesive, like a family. This was a major focus the writers put into the game, and while that in places caused less player choice, I think it was really refreshing. It is, in fact, a very good thing that every game has a different dynamic to the groups. Origins, for example, very specifically doesn't have a party that gets along very well, but the overhead threat forces them together in a way that allows bickering and differences to be set aside. Inquisition's party is often referred to as co-workers, and while I think that is a common misperception largely caused by the horribly bugged companion banter system, I do understand why some see it this way. Even with this canonically being the only group to come together for a group activity, it does feel like a lot of them are very disconnected. And to be fully honest, I'm pretty sure if the Dragon Age 2 party was all together in one place on their downtime, someone would be murdered and Aveline would have to cover it up. The differences in these groups are a good thing, including Veilguard. Veilguard allows you to be present during the building of relationships between the group, the common ground the characters find, the bonding over how to keep everyone fed, for example. Their disagreements happen, but they're often solved and they grow beyond it. And yes, I do understand that the game being a therapy session is a common complaint by people, and while I do think the level of emotional maturity exhibited by the characters sometimes hampers the writing, I think it's actually really beautiful to finally have a game in the series where the team is actually a team. And quite frankly, seeing characters grow and relationships be fostered is a huge touchstone appeal to Bioware games to me. To some extent, it baffles me that so many people are resistant to the very idea of characters coming together and growing together in the genre of game that's built on getting to know and aiding companions. I have a hard time seeing this as a total negative that others do. I think it's a welcome change of pace for this one game. And yes, I do mean one game. Every game should have unique dynamics between the group. It doesn't have to be a carbon copy and paste. I do think part of the reason Veilguard is built the way it is specifically to counteract the loss of the keep. There's a term that was thrown around a lot in online spaces between Inquisition and Veilguard, known as quantum. A quantum character essentially was one that could not easily be accounted for in the Dragon Age keep, because their existence involves so many varying choices that it would be difficult to revisit them in a future game. Difficult, but not impossible. Bioware's response to this problem was to remove the keep out of play entirely, a choice that likely was always going to have to happen. But in lieu of it, they decided the best replacement was an in-game option that's semi-hidden and only offers 3 options, 2 of which occurred in an optional DLC you couldn't even access if you played on the 360 or PS3. Systems a huge amount of people played the games on, as next-gen consoles were still new and expensive at the time. Outside of the 3 choices, your Inquisition romance option and building your Inquisitors look from the ground up, nothing else survives the culling. Now, to be fair, it's hard to say if this was a purposeful choice by the team, or an overhead choice made by executives at the top of Bioware or from EA, so I hesitate to go in fully on Bioware for making this decision. I also sympathize with the choice itself. The Keep, Inquisition's World State transfer site, has been in poor condition for years, going down all the time for days or even weeks at a time. It not only made sense, but was downright necessary to go into something in-engine. I also empathize with the issue of the world state. It's inherently deeply difficult to maintain a vastness of choice in a series that has to account for every previous choice you've ever made. It's hard to build a game on the pieces of every multiple choice decision you've offered the player, and that means a certain level of streamlining is understandable. But the removal of nearly every single choice save 3 was a bridge too far, in my opinion. I would contend this hurt a great variance of things throughout the game. It hurts the game's ability to explore many aspects of the lore due to the need to keep certain aspects somewhat vague so as not to contradict your choices. It forced certain writing decisions to accidentally contradict previous decisions and lore just through the need to design in spite of this lost context. More than anything, it greatly harmed 90% of the legacy characters brought over into the game. The most central returning characters survived this issue in my opinion, but 2 of the 3 decisions you make in the character creator are all about them. Controversially, I think that Harding is done really well as well. They acknowledge the very young age that Harding is an Inquisition in a way that I think most people ignore, and I think that's handled well. But every other returning character that makes it into the game are robbed of so much context that the game has to either underutilize them to avoid a certain level of contradiction, or in the worst case with Morrigan, make huge decisions on her character without that context, and then brush aside the implications of that decision. To be clear, my issue isn't necessarily with the world state or romance or anything like that with Morrigan, it's just the direction of the character. What is done or specifically not done with Morrigan is perhaps my biggest gripe with the game, personally, and I am absolutely certain I'll likely make a video about that someday, when I've survived the production hell of this video and am ready to talk about Dragon Age again. The Inquisitor returns as a husk of a character, which isn't necessarily a crime in my opinion, as they were always a blank slate character for you to build that wouldn't work as well as, say, Hawk. However, this missing world state makes them a shell that's only there to serve as slight fan service, and to empower one's character in the game, as is unfortunately true for a lot of characters in this story. On this one, however, I feel I need to defend the devs, as it's an awful decision between adding too much to the character or not enough. There's no possible way to make everybody happy with such a decision. This is proven by the previous game, which swung too far in the other direction, making choices on personality traits with their cameo that felt very intrusive to many players' vision of their characters. As with many decisions in this game, you can trace the thought process to its conclusion, and your mileage may vary on if it's a good or bad decision. I lean toward good, as very few headcanons can be hurt by the Inquisitor's appearance in Veilguard. In a game of compromises, this is one of the more understandable ones. The truth is, no matter what I've said up to this point, I really loved my experience with Veilguard. In one specific respect, I liked it better than anything since Origins, as it offered a level of character creation that had been sorely lacking from the series, in my opinion. More than that, I liked my character, even with the limited choice and tone it offered. I greatly enjoy this kind of system more than, say, Dragon Age 2, or even Inquisition, which offers much less in terms of actual background. Character creation, specifically, is a huge plus for me. I love taking breaks between missions and going back to the lighthouse, solving its puzzles, and listening to your companions banter and interact about their lives and surroundings. Bonding. I was excited each and every time I saw that little light on that indicated I could talk to my companions. I loved the crossroads. I love how they were able to add insight to lore and the major antagonists. I just really loved the emphasis on character. Yes, there wasn't much conflict. Yes, you were kind of shoehorned into being friends with all the characters. Those are absolutely valid complaints. But that's what I want to do anyway, and that's what a lot of people who love this genre love to experience. Veilguard allowed me to get to know a series of characters that grew together, that accomplished something as a team that truly grew to rely on one another in order to accomplish it, rather than just put their petty differences aside for 3 odd seconds. Just like the previous games, there are faults here to the ends of the earth, but it also offers a character-driven story that I come back to in this genre for time and time again, and that's not something that's always pulled off, even within this subgenre. I'll value every second it took to get Nev to trust me. I'll remember every heartbreaking second of Balara's journey with grief. I'll never forget standing beside Emmerich as he struggled with living life or embracing what comes after. I will love these characters just as much as those that came before. Despite Veilguard's many flaws, it still appeals to that which brings me to these series in the first place. Connecting with others, learning about them, finding new perspectives, and sitting in the fascinating characterizations born of a world so similar yet so different from our own. It's very hard for me to look at Veilguard the way the internet presents it. I find it frustrating that it's been singled out as the death cry of this series, because I feel fogged nostalgia goggles are what caused this view. The uncomfortable truth I think a lot of us don't want to admit is that Dragon Age has always been a messy series from the jump, and Veilguard is not the perpetrator of this grand assassination attempt on Dragon Age like others claim it to be. Veilguard is simply a compromise, an example of what the series was evolving into, and I can understand not being on board for that. I can't pretend that something important wasn't lost in this transition, and I do mourn that loss. But I do think value was still found here, and I wish that value could be analyzed and accepted for what it is rather than what it is not. Regardless of how I view the game, I wish Veilguard was accepted as a symptom of a problem Dragon Age has had from the moment EA acquired Bioware, just like its previous entries. Because that's what it is. The next in a series of corporate missteps that the franchise has always, and I do mean always, had to deal with. I think Veilguard is owed the grace that the previous entries are given while blinded by totally fogged nostalgia goggles. I think we've allowed time to tell a story about Dragon Age that is not true. And maybe that's why I made this video in the first place. Maybe I just want those goggles to be lowered enough to recognize that Veilguard is not the root issue it's presented as, but just another symptom. And that was the way the Veilguard section of this video was supposed to end. I finished editing it on June 10th. And then, on June 11th, I was almost done, Bloomberg! I was almost done! Yes, I'm still rewriting sections in June. I had a mutual refer to my video as Sisyphean, and I quite agree, but I promise this is important. Bloomberg's Jason Schreier dropped an article that covered the production history of Dragon Age The Veilguard, with multiple anonymous interviews from the people who worked on it. The revelations in this article clarify so many of the issues with the game that it's absolutely staggering. And while I attempted to nearly fit the highlights into other sections of the video, it felt absolutely impossible to do so without diluting the whole project. So in lieu of yet another full rewrite, I have decided to present parts of this article to you in much the same timeline as I experienced it. At the conclusion of my time talking about this game, as a unifying factor of all this project was, of how so much went wrong, and how it impacts the view of Veilguard as presented here. The answer isn't too far from what I suspected, but it is certainly enlightening. As always, if you want the full story, please go to Jason's work, as this was a monumental piece of investigative journalism on this topic. There's a link in the description. I'll only be going over specific relevant quotes. There's plenty more to be found in the work itself, so please support it. As was reported for years and years, DA4 was shifted to a live service game in 2017. The devs, as expected, were not particularly happy about this change, and the article even mentions that Mike Laidlaw invited the team into a conference room to break the news. Quote, "One day in October 2017, Laidlaw summoned his colleagues into a conference room and pulled out a few pricey bottles of whiskey. The next Dragon Age sequel, he told the room, would also be pivoting to an online live service game, a decision from above that he disagreed with. He was resigning from the studio. The assembled staff stayed late through the night, drinking and reminiscing about the franchise they loved." Unquote. Now, I wasn't going to mention this quote initially, however, after ruminating on it in the ensuing hours following the report, I've come to the personal conclusion that this exact moment might be when Bioware itself died. It's not Andromeda's failed launch, it's not the switch in management, it's not even the upcoming failure of Anthem, but instead this mourning for a team who made RPGs, realizing that not only would they have to learn a new skill set they absolutely do not have, but also the knowledge that the games they wanted to make, the games that built the company, were no longer valued. The thing they loved and had spent nearly a decade on had no value to the corporate structure, to the point where one of their leads resigned and it changed nothing. Bioware no longer cared what they brought to the table. They had been told their ways, the old ways, the ways that built the company, were done. A fact that is proven in Veilguard. While the revelation that the game moving to a live service format turning out to be something that hurt the overall production shouldn't come as a surprise, what might actually be the biggest revelation in this article was that switching back to a single-player game was also a huge weight around the neck of the project. Quote, "Above all, sources point to the rebooting of the product from a single-player game to a multiplayer one, and then back again, a switcheroo that muddled development and inflated the title's budget," they say, ultimately setting the stage for EA's potentially unrealistic sales expectations. A spokesperson for EA declined to comment, unquote. Which, of course, they declined to comment. That's unsurprising. The article would later go on to say, quote, "In the wake of BioWare's second consecutive flop, the multiplayer version of Dragon Age continued to take shape. While the previous games in the franchise had featured tactical combat, this one would be all action. Instead of quests that players would only experience once, it would be full of missions that could be replayed repeatedly with friends and strangers. Important characters couldn't die, because they had to persist for multiplayer players across never-ending gameplay. As the game evolved over the next 2 years, the failure of Anthem hovered over the studio. Were they making the same mistakes? Some BioWare employees scoffed that they were simply building Anthem with dragons." Unquote. In the wake of Anthem's failure, Dara and Hudson's departure, and the pandemic, and likely in the wake of Legendary Edition's release, although to be very clear, Jason Schreier does not say that, BioWare higher-ups would make the decision to change the project back to a single-player focus. Quote, "In theory, the reversion back to Dragon Age's tried-and-true single-player format should have been welcome news inside BioWare. But there was a catch. Typically, this kind of pivot would be coupled with a reset and a period of pre-production, allowing the designers to formulate a new vision for the game. Instead, the team was asked to change the game's fundamental structure and recast the entire story on the fly, according to people familiar with the new marching orders. They were given a year and a half to finish and told to aim for as wide a market as possible." Unquote. I'd like to take a second to put that quote into perspective. A year and a half. 18 months. That's what they thought they had to make this game work. 4 more months than DA2 had in production. Back then, Dara and Laidlaw and the rest of the team made the smart decision to put aside their sequel dreams and make something work on its own with the time given. This team did not have that option at all. Inquisition had pigeonholed them into creating what was essentially an exact sequel, with stakes just as large, if not larger, than its previous entry had had. Despite being in production for 5 years at that point, the developers now had to turn around a project that was half-prepped and make it into a completely different genre, with a completely different playstyle and goal, and do that in a year and a half during a pandemic. Quote, "This strict deadline became a reoccurring problem. The development team would make decisions believing that they had less than a year to release the game, which severely limited the stories they could tell and the world they could build. Then the title would inevitably be delayed a few months, at which point they'd be stuck with these old decisions with no chance to stop and reevaluate what was working. At the end of 2022, amid continually dizzying leadership changes, the studio started distributing an alpha build of Dragon Age to get feedback internally and from outside playtesters. According to people familiar with the process, the reactions were concerning. The game's biggest problem, early players agreed, was a lack of satisfying choices and consequences. Previous Bioware titles had presented players with gut-wrenching decisions. Which allies to save, which factions to spare, which enemies to slay. Such dilemmas made fans feel like they were shaping the narrative. Historically, a big draw for many Bioware games. But Dragon Age's multiplayer roots limited such choices, according to people familiar with the development. Bioware delayed the game's release again while the team shoehorned in a few major decisions. Unquote. I'm diverting from this quote here for a spoiler's sake. Continued at the end of the sentence, quote, "But because most of the parameters were already well established, the designers struggled to pair the newly retrofitted choices for players with meaningful consequences downstream." Unquote. This explains heavily the game's struggle with player agency. While the massive choice highlighted in the article that I mentioned several times during this video is, I think, really effectively handled, it's also absolutely the only major decision you get to see the consequences of in-game. I'm glad they added it. I'm glad they redid environments to fit the choice, but agency is not one massive decision, it's a series of choices and consequences. And now we know why there's so little of that in Veilguard. Because the game they built for Bioware did not support the RPG Bioware now wanted them to make. And with a year and a half to make the game and limited resources, the likelihood of adding other choices that feel impactful on a system not supported for it was not very high. You couldn't impact factions or landscapes or stories very well when the skeleton of the game was already pre-built on the assumption that all of the bones in place were essential. And that brings us back to something David Gator, who I swear I don't want to talk about this much for, let's say, reasons, but who is unfortunately essential to most discussions Dragon Age, even if he feels shoehorned into certain ones, which in this article he definitely is, mentioned in the Blue Sky tweets, posts, whatever he did, the things that David Gator wrote that I referenced earlier in regards to his struggle in the studio. That comes right back around to this. Quote, "In 2023, to help finish Dragon Age, Bioware brought in a second internal team, which was working on the next Mass Effect game. For decades, there had been tension between the two well-established camps, known for their starkly divergent ways of doing things. Bioware developers like to joke that the Dragon Age crew was like a pirate ship, meandering and sometimes traveling off course but eventually reaching the port. In contrast, the Mass Effect group was called the USS Enterprise, after the Star Trek ship, because commands were issued straight down from the top and executed zealously. As the Mass Effect directors took control, they scoffed that the Dragon Age squad had been doing a shoddy job and began excluding their leaders from pivotal meetings, according to the people familiar with the internal friction. Over time, the Mass Effect team went on to overhaul parts of the game and design a number of additional scenes, including a rich emotional finale that players loved. But even changes that appeared to improve the game stoked the simmering rancor inside Bioware, infuriating Dragon Age leaders who had been told they didn't have the budget for such big, ambitious swings. It always seemed that when the Mass Effect team made its demands in meetings with EA regarding the resources it needed, it got its way, said David Gator, a former lead writer on the Dragon Age franchise who left before the development of the new game started. But Dragon Age always had to fight against headwinds. Unquote. I highlight this not to just confirm the Mass Effect bias that the Bioware offices have, however it's very clearly true since this was essentially a coup, but instead to show just how many hands this project moved between. Now, to offer credit to the ME devs, I do think the ending was handled incredibly well, so they get plenty of praise from me on that front. But this knowledge explains why the game feels so confused narratively and in dialogue, as far too many people touch this game with a different series of conflicting priorities. It also explains very clearly why the game feels less like Dragon Age and so very much like Mass Effect. If Bioware trusted the ME team that much to muscle in on the leadership, they certainly still had that Mass Effect game bias, and it shows in the actual gameplay presented. Now, in an attempt to be fair, I recognize some folks will immediately look at this and say, oh, so the ME team made the game better. I recognize that some people who played the game pretty much only like the ending, and that's fair. There's already a pre-made bias against the DA devs team out there, which I have attempted to present evenly, because I am deeply disappointed by how badly they dropped the ball with the setting of Thedas, its politics, and most certainly the fantasy racism that is beyond abhorrent in the year 2025. But at the same time, they were under an insane amount of crunch, have faced absolutely vitriolic hate campaigns that made me so afraid for them that I have been careful not to bring some of them up for fear of those campaigns starting up again, and most importantly for the topic at hand, they were so clearly undervalued and undersupported by Bioware. When you take, for example, my criticism of the game being a shallow reading of Thedas and its politics, when you look at the prism of the game with the knowledge in mind that the DA team were essentially pushed out of the way by the Mass Effect dev team, and you take in the failures of the setting of Thedas as a whole in Veilguard, is it any wonder that the world feels lacking? That the political depth of the game has been scrubbed out? I'm not necessarily saying that the Dragon Age team itself wasn't at fault for many of these failings. But having a team outside of your own with totally different values suddenly exclude you from the room when working on the game you are in charge of is concerning. And there's no real reason at all to believe that the Mass Effect team had enough of a love for the lore or the setting to add anything other than very surface-level thoughts and ideas to the project. And to be fair, why would they? It's not their job to know the world of Thedas intimately or to understand how it ticks or even to know the appeal of the series. In their opinion, they're just here to clean up the mess. So maybe you're willing to give them credit on a job well done for what they did add to the game, and sure, that's fair. But what did they not add? What did they take out? To bring up a passage from the article I referenced earlier, quote, "Early testers and Mass Effect leads complained about the game's snarky tone, a style of video game storytelling once ascendant that was quickly falling out of fashion in pop culture but had been part of Goldman's vision for the multiplayer game. Worried that Dragon Age could face the same outcome as Forspoken, a recent title that had been hammered over its impertinent banter, Bioware leaders ordered a belated rewrite of the game's dialogue to make it sound more serious. In the end, the resulting tonal inconsistencies would only add to the game's poor reception with fans." Unquote. There's a pretty strong issue with this approach, you see, and it comes from a core misunderstanding of an important aspect of the series. Previously, I had criticisms of the tone indicators in the game, how it felt so often that they didn't match what you were choosing, that they essentially all followed the same line and lacked diversity in choice. We now know that at least part of the problem was the bones of the game itself, that inflexibility. But there's one specific tone indicator that I dunked on that very much conflicts with this writing choice, and it's the sarcasm tone indicator. Despite my previous complaints about DA2's dialogue wheel, the sarcastic tone option is one of the most iconic ones in the entire series. I mean, I put a 3-minute sequence of its greatest hits into this video just because I felt like it. So thanks, Jason, for making the editing decision mean something. I really appreciate it. When that tone indicator appeared in the trailers, its mere presence caused revelry in the fanbase. It was the return of the king, but when we actually got to use it, it was absolutely neutered. And gosh darn it, it just so happens that that choice would require a snarky tone. To me, it's absolutely impossible to not suggest that these two things have correlation, and on a wider note, it so clearly explains why the dialogue is so wooden in so many areas of the game. One final quote. "A mass layoff at Bioware and a mandate to work overtime depleted morale, while a voice actor strike limited the writer's ability to revise the dialogue and create new scenes. The initial trailer made the next Dragon Age seem more like Fortnite than a dark fantasy role-playing game, triggering concerns that EA didn't know how to market the game." Unquote. Now, setting aside the mention of Dragon Age being a dark fantasy role-playing game, something that hasn't been true since DA2 and was really barely true in DA2 itself. The core of that, to me, is still the source of the issue. In 2023, a team that not only didn't know the tone and feel of the series, that clearly didn't understand its setting, and who was not obligated to understand any of it, took over in a massive way and demanded a rewriting process. In that same year, a huge swath of the team was laid off, leaving a beleaguered working force at the center of a project that, yes, had gotten more time, but had been absolutely gutted, and who were likely entirely unsure of who their real bosses were, if the chaos of that time is anything to go on. Disgruntled and exhausted and worried for their livelihoods, these workers, under extreme crunch, attempted to put out 1,000 fires of conflicting, chaotic, Bioware-approved leadership. And in the end, you get a project that is all over the place, pacing-wise, tone-wise, and yes, at the center of everything and anything I say in this video, identity-wise. And when they finally start to see the sun over the horizon, when EA mandates a trailer, what comes out isn't what you want the game to be seen as, what anyone in the company wants the game to be seen as, and the damage is already done. Now the worst reactionaries on the internet are going to hate you on principle, and many fans will walk away disappointed too. This amalgamation of issues will now come in repeated riptides for the rest of the year, pre- and post-launch, and now you can only try to survive it. Is it any wonder then that the entire marketing of this game revolved around the characters? They are, after all, at the center of any game BioWare makes. Even the Mass Effect team recognizes that. It's one of the unifying agreements the whole company has, even in the wake of all this strife. And to me, that's what makes this game work so well. That's what frames the narrative and saves it from its failings. Character. Unified grief. Regret. It's a miracle these characters connect at all, with the amount of mismanagement and stress and crunch and internal coups happening all at once. And for that, I express immeasurable appreciation to the character writers, for they delivered for me where everything else failed. But I'm not everyone, and the rest of the people who love or like or who were always going to pick up a Dragon Age game don't all have that mindset. And if the characters didn't click, and the combat, which was good, didn't click, nothing else was ever going to. And as has always been the case with Dragon Age, that can, in the end, be blamed on 1,000 different failures, all stemming from one core source: the people in charge of BioWare and their mismanagement of their own company under the watchful eye of Electronic Arts. I hope the takeaway from this video isn't Dragon Age was always bad, or anything nearing that level of reactionary rhetoric. Believe it or not, I love all of these games. When the video is over, when the many months of production I put into it ceases, I'm fairly certain I'm going to do at least one full series replay by the end of the year, when I'm not so tired. I played Veilguard twice for this video, originally when it came out, and then through the middle of March and beginning of April. But I want to see everything leading up to it and watch the lore evolve. I want to catch new Easter eggs now that I have a different context after Veilguard, and there just wasn't time to do that with how long this video took. Hell, there wasn't even really time for the second playthrough of Veilguard, but I felt it was necessary. I'm going to be playing a lot of this series, even after putting this video to rest, and who knows, maybe my relationship with Veilguard might grow into an unexpected direction, positive or negative, the more I play it. But that won't change why I made this video or make it obsolete. There was a large part of me, especially in the wake of Veilguard, that didn't want to talk about the game's faults. But to do so would have missed the point, that burgeoning issue that I had with the entire discourse that came in the wake of it. Some of my defensiveness of this game, I think, comes from the strong belief that Dragon Age is a series of imperfect beauty. While I showed the series at its worst in this video, I equally tried to shine a light on what each game did well, Veilguard included. I didn't want to shy away from its faults, but I wanted to spend a good amount of time focusing on its strengths because it never gets to show its strengths. The reason for that is because I rewrote this section of the script several times, largely because of the frustration I have for Veilguard's discourse, the frustration that caused me to make this video in the first place. The point of this video is not Veilguard good, actually. If you don't like Veilguard, that's fine. If you feel it's too wild a departure, you're probably right, it is. But that is most certainly not a unique issue to Veilguard, as every single game has been a wild departure from what was done before, and it's only the fog of history that stops people from recognizing that. I have been a fan of this series since practically the beginning. I have watched this cycle happen before, and I am just frustrated by this regurgitated idea that Veilguard is not a Dragon Age game. Because in truth, at the end of this long path, do we even know what a Dragon Age game is? Have we ever? In a vacuum, Veilguard can be seen as this betrayal of the series, this ultimate corporate decision for one game that ruined a legacy, these writers that absolutely destroyed what was established. But the point of this very long video, I hope, has been to express that what Veilguard is the culmination of a lot of decisions that the games, and the studio specifically, have already made. And that ultimate choice has less to do with the devs and the writers than some want to admit. The truth is, there's a clearly defined line between previous decisions in previous games and the ones made here. The move to action RPG combat was made because of the series' console success and the history of CRPG features coming and going, with empirical evidence of them not being as used as they should be with the amount of effort put into them. The removal of more casual character conversations are a result of cost-cutting and limiting resources. The loss of those CRPG elements, the limiting of choice, the removal of the keep, all of these massive steps back in decision-making are caused by a multitude of issues going back multiple games, ranging from the Jenga Tower of choice, or EA's refusal to take care of the keep servers, or this repeated recognition by devs and writers of the past that Bioware has an anti-RPG bias. The more you look at this series, the more you look at Bioware since the acquisition from EA, and especially in the last decade, the more it becomes clear that the vast majority of issues with the studio are with the studio and EA as a corporate structure. And while dev teams and writers certainly make mistakes, blaming them for the game's failures or their series' rudderless direction based off the information that we have is a mistake. Dragon Age as a series is an oddity. It is perhaps the single greatest example of how corporate whims can vastly alter a series until it no longer resembles itself. Every single time this series has released a new game, it hasn't looked anything like the game that came before it. Whether it be plugging a gap in the schedule, or EA's constant wish to chase whatever lucrative trend they see in the market at any given time, this series has changed a dozen times over in every single development cycle, an amalgamation of what limitations or overhead EA and Bioware execs forced them to make, whatever market wishes shaped both opinions, and whatever the writers and developers of the game could bring to the table in spite of those limitations. And yet, the series has survived, and still managed to offer something unique. Some of the best and worst aspects of every single game has come out of this constant churning elixir of elements, and it's something that has greatly snakebitten the series time and time again. But it has also made it special. That is why I am so resistant to this idea that Veilguard ruined the series, or that Veilguard just isn't a Dragon Age game, because the truth is, I don't think there has ever been a definition of a Dragon Age game. The only fitting descriptor left is exactly the definition that describes every other choice-based RPG, a vague stamp that offers no differentiation from any other game like it. It's Fantasy Mass Effect now, and as much as that label leaves such a bad taste in my mouth, the series' inability to settle has made it the only accurate one left. This has always been a rudderless series, built off of compromise after compromise until eventually there were no compromises left to make. Veilguard is not a knife in the back made in the shadow of night, but instead a lifetime's worth of decisions that can be pointed out and identified every step of the way. And that, more than anything, is what Dragon Age is. A series of inconsistencies, birthed of compromises that spawned 4 wildly different games that just so happen to have the same banner and setting. Every single installment after the first is guilty of extreme change, and Veilguard is just the most recent, and perhaps the farthest point in the sky from where we began. But despite that, I think this repeated change is something that has worked in the series' favor, if perhaps not always commercially or review-wise, but among fans. If you take a single step into the Dragon Age fandom, you will immediately be shocked to find that there is nearly no common consensus in what is the best game, which has the best gameplay, who the best protagonist or companion is, or what the best overall story is. Sure, there are somewhat agreed upon truths, and sure, most fandoms have these differences of opinion, but the level of disagreement in the fandom is vast compared to its same setting-based contemporaries. If you are a part of the Dragon Age fandom, I have challenged some of those, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, I say 4 hours into the video. I've tried my best to present both my arguments and arguments for those that disagree with me in the fandom throughout this video, because I respect that community and their conflicting views. This is an exact replica of the Jack issue I brought up earlier, except it is to a far bigger extreme. Instead of choosing between 2 games or 1, it is every single entry. And strangely, I find that beautiful. Dragon Age is a series that's been out for 16 years now, and with that amount of time and that massive a series of changes, the series' appeal is not a unifying factor among its fans. Dragon Age is not Origins anywhere near as much as it is Veilguard. It can't be any single one of these games, because it's never been consistent enough to resemble one another. And while that lack of consistency is a massive negative, it's also allowed every game to be a new experience, a new entry point, a new beginning. And you can choose not to believe me now, but I promise you, one day, Veilguard will be one of those new beginnings for fans with incredibly well-articulated points as to why. The cycle of this series is one of rebirth and fresh perspective. New fans arriving from the new wild swings with new perspectives, ones that redefine what Dragon Age is to each of them. Rebirth is achieved through the adoration of an identity built off inconsistent imperfection. And that's not something very many series can claim. On the 29th of January, it was announced by Bioware that a major restructuring was happening within the company. This was something that had already been hinted at as they went forward, mentioning there would be no DLC for Veilguard and that all focus would be put onto the next Mass Effect. What no one expected at the time was that this refocusing would lead to the second series of mass layoffs from the company in just over a year. This was not a small trickle, this was a flood. An entire development team from top to bottom either moved to new projects or in different studios within EA, or seemingly, more commonly, laid off entirely. High and low level devs and writers took to social media to announce their departure in spades, and it was an absolutely heartbreaking thing to see. Now, Bioware themselves were extremely dodgy when announcing this. This release was an attempt to reimagine how we work at Bioware, and that these releases would allow for a more agile, focused studio, all while expertly dodging an actual admittance to the length and width of cutting an entire team that had just gotten a game onto shelves that higher-ups had changed the direction of time and time again, after they themselves had a major cut a year before. I find it absolutely deplorable that Bioware put the full weight of their entire studio solely on the shoulders of this team, while also constantly forcing them to make changes, and this is the thanks they get. Perhaps they lost a lot of funding, perhaps EA forced them into this, or perhaps this is just an abject cruelty in the face of not making the profits they unreasonably expected on the project. I'm not sure. What I do know is that this word salad of key phrases ignores the real human cost of this decision. And perhaps what unsettles me most is how actual gamers, including fans of the series, treated these devs afterward. I really thought we as a whole were better than cheering on a corporation doing mass layoffs because you didn't like a f***ing video game, but I guess not. I have no chill in my soul for anybody that celebrated that decision. Many have said this is the death of the Dragon Age IP. I don't know if that's true. While I question the existence of another Mass Effect game from a creative standpoint, I also know that many will flock to Mass Effect 4 or 5 or whatever it is now that didn't pick up Dragon Age. An unfortunate but enduring truth about Bioware has been that despite Inquisition being the best-selling game in the company's history, Dragon Age has always been a distant second to Mass Effect as an IP in terms of Bioware heads, marketing, and consistent sales. To some extent, I can't be mad at that. As I've said many times, Mass Effect is a consistent commodity. It's easier to sell. I don't, however, think Veilguard underselling means they won't make another. But I do question what that would look like. I question if the Mass Effect team will also be laid off, or if they'll be moved to work on the next Dragon Age. Maybe Bioware will rehire the lost team or hire out for another, but I don't think they would ever put that kind of money into Dragon Age again. Or maybe the company will simply put all their eggs in the basket of the military sci-fi shooter and hope for a continued survival in the face of extreme danger. I have personally always been vocal that new writers joining and old writers leaving a project is a silly thing to point to as an example of a series dying. I personally have always thought that sort of thinking is resistant to humanity's history as a storytelling species. I have always questioned the idea that a person or group of people can own an idea, and therefore can be the only ones to have the right to create art from it. That is an extreme view, I recognize that. But I really do believe in the collaborative history of humans telling stories around the campfire, and while that doesn't always translate to 21st century capitalism, I do think that belief can extend to the unfortunate corporate wish to continue a series without their previous safekeepers. So I am wholly resistant to the idea that no one can make Dragon Age except Gator and Dara and Laidlaw. I think there was an unhealthy aspect of Veilguard's discourse that revolved around where did the real Bioware go, by pointing out all the people that left the project. I don't buy into the idea that they represent Dragon Age more than anyone else, especially when two of them were very late to the origins of the series. That discludes the people that were around at the beginning that weren't around after Origins. That discludes people that stayed until Inquisition and then left at that point. That discludes people that were there until the day of these mass layoffs and were there since the very beginning but aren't counted because a certain amount of people left before that. With the amount of people that put their hands on a video game story, I don't necessarily believe that any one person has the right to say they are who made Dragon Age, and that's why I'm not particularly keen to dismiss others who have been around for a long time that are still working on it as if they are not important like 3 core members. I think the way writing rooms work, especially in video games, is more complicated than that. I think this callous mass layoff proves more than anything else that it's Bioware higher-ups and EA's micromanaging that caused those departures and hurt the art, not the new team that likely struggled the same way as their predecessors, except without the tenure. They were not valued. With that extreme anti-trademark nonsense out of the way, however, it hurts to see the very last people to have worked on Dragon Age be forced out of the studio. Trickweeks, for example, headed Veilguard and had been with the series since 2005. This year would have been Trick's 20th year with the company. That level of talent being casually tossed aside in the hopes that the next project will be a gold mine, that's a loss and a miscalculation. That's a tragedy. And they're not alone. Karen West Week's lead editor is gone after 19 years. Producer Jen Chiveri is gone after 14 years. System designer Michelle Flam is gone after 10 plus years. Cheryl Chi was cast to another studio after having been with the franchise since the start. Narrative editor Ryan Cormier has been released after 26 years in the industry. The list goes on and on and on. You cannot say under any circumstances that this was only new staff, and it should not have to be said, whether they were there 6 months or 20 years, that their firing was unjust. It was. It is for this reason that I have no interest in whatever Bioware might do with Dragon Age going forward. And this is not a slight to the Mass Effect team, or whoever works on the next Dragon Age game, if it's ever made at all. What it is instead a slight on the corporate greed that cut at the heart and soul of each of these games, hurting those that shepherded the series through each development cycle. It is baffling, and yet a perfect example of the issue, that these companies don't seem to understand that they have no existence and no legacy without those that worked on the games. And if they can't respect the people that made all of these moments for us, if they think they're the shepherds for a series that has consistently been bit over and over again by EA corporate needs to chase trends or crunch out a game, if they think they are what made Dragon Age special, they are sorely, sorely mistaken and delusional. It is their decisions that assured Dragon Age had no identity. It is their decisions that hurt Veilguard and every game that came before it. The blood is on the hands of the overseers, not the inmates. Now, to end this video on a hopeful note, I'd like to point out a quote by Cheryl Chi. I've spent several moments in this video talking about how much I love Liliana, and how I feel she's just as much an important figurehead of the franchise as Morrigan or Solus or Varric. Cheryl has written her since the beginning, while also offering her voice to Isabella, Blackwell, and Harding, all positively iconic in their own right. Cheryl mentioned something on Blue Sky that gave me a certain amount of hope. A conclusion that couldn't heal any of the pain caused, but could set your heart at ease at the very least. Quote, "But DA isn't dead. There's Fix, there's art, there's connections we made through the games and because of the games. Technically, EA/Bioware owns the IP, but you can't own an idea, no matter how much they want to. DA isn't dead because it's yours now." Unquote. When I wrote the original script of this video, my original intent was to point out the inconsistencies of the series and how Bioware have snake-bitten it to always be less than what it can be. But in the wake of its writing, in the wake of having spent half a year with this video, and in the wake of seeing the best minds of the franchise be so callously thrown aside, I think the new conclusion I've come to is this. It's the minds of Thedas that are the true core of what Dragon Age is. It's the people that care about Thedas and its politics and its world that are ultimately the core of what Dragon Age is. The writers like Cheryl, the project heads like Dara, the birther of its world like Gator, but also the fans. Shockingly, to myself at least, I think my underlying intent was more positive than I gave myself credit for, whether I realized it or not. My point was to recollect ourselves during a dark period, and examine this thing as Dragon Age fans we all love. As much as this video is hopefully here on YouTube for everyone, I realistically know that the audience it was made for are the same ones that write and draw and create, and have been in the fandom for the last 10 years or more, keeping it alive while the rest of the world forgot it. And my greatest hope is that this video is not taken as a dismissal of Dragon Age's legacy, but instead a criticism turned statement on how this series has been so stunted by corporate greed from the very beginning, and survived it because of those that actually care about the world of Thedas and its characters. Perhaps my obsession with identifying what Dragon Age is from a corporate level was misguided. When I look back at the franchise, even through my nitpicks, almost every major decision that truly bothers me about the franchise, truly muddies it, truly leaves it lesser, has by and large not been because of the writers or developers or the fans, but instead the gatekeepers who own the IP. At the end of this journey, what I realize most of all is that its identity is within the people that love it and define it. And that's a beauty no corporate decision can ever take away. So don't trust Bioware to keep Dragon Age alive. If we love it this much more than the people that hold the IP for it, maybe it's time we do it ourselves. Holy Jesus, I think I'm done. This has been an 8-month ordeal? Well, 7. November doesn't really count. I only worked on it maybe 1 week in that month, but who knows, it might be 8 months actually if I decide to pull it apart when I export it and watch it. But point being, the legwork is done. The bulk of it is done. If you listen this far in, thank you. I hope I've made my point well. This became a statement on making art under corporate America. It got very weird, but I'm very proud of it, even though who knows how I'll feel about it in a year or 5 years or whatever. I mean, I have been known to change my opinion on things years after, but the core of this video, the what is Dragon Age part, really isn't going to change. So, I'd like to thank my friends who suffered through me having multiple mental breakdowns through the process of making this video. Thank you for looking at the multiple images of my DaVinci Resolve timeline and pretending you know exactly what it meant. I know those got annoying, so thank you for that. And to one friend in particular, thank you for reminding me that it would be a waste to give up at the end of this project. I don't know if I would have finished this without people reminding me of that. I'd also like to thank Wolfsong the Bloody Beast and These Colliding Hearts specifically for helping me find quotes for the Veilguard section of this video for the character profiles. You have no idea how much help that was, so thank you. I've left links to sources in the bio, as well as any videos I might have taken small amounts of footage of, so if you could please go support them, that would be appreciated too. Be good to each other in the comments. I mean, be good to the devs too in the comments. This video isn't anti-criticism. I think I spent an hour criticizing Veilguard, but while the game deserves a large level of criticism, maybe we keep it to a simmer, respectably, in the comments? Just a thought. Either way, if you liked this, and you're looking for this again from me at some point, almost certainly not gonna happen, but if you like the vibes, you can do the subscribe thing or whatever. I have a list of content that I want to do, but I don't plan to criticize things again anytime soon. If you're just here for the Dragon Age content, I'm sure I'll make more, but it's not going to be anytime soon. But you know, I'm not going to keep myself constrained. I have a list of things I want to do, and I'm going to do all of them once I'm rested. So, thank you for sitting through 5 hours of this. Hopefully whatever I do next will be maybe an 1/8 as long. Okay. I think both you and I have heard enough of my voice for a while. Goodbye. By the way, I know it's end quote, not unquote. It just became increasingly funny to me as I accidentally used it, so I kept it in, and I know people are very angry right now, but if you're not, check the comments. Let's count how many people are really, really mad and don't know because they didn't stay to the end. Okay, bye.